He grabbed her by the collar and threw her against the counter like she weighed nothing. "Kneel," he said, not loud, almost bored. "Kneel and say you're sorry for breathing my air." The diner went silent, 23 people holding their breath, rain hammering the windows. A child somewhere in the back started to cry, then stopped. Even the child understood that crying was dangerous right now. Leora Vale didn't kneel. She set down the coffee pot she was holding, slowly, deliberately, and she looked at the man who'd just thrown her. Looked at him the way you look at something you've already decided how to handle. That was the moment. Not the gun he pulled out next, not the 6 armed men flooding through the door behind him, not the blood trail leading from the back booth toward the kitchen, left by a man nobody had noticed yet. The moment was that look. If you've ever been told to get on your knees by someone who believed they owned the room, if you've ever felt that specific species of humiliation that comes from being dismissed as nobody, then you already understand what Leora did next. And if you want to know how one woman, alone, on a Tuesday night, in a broken-down diner at the edge of a city that forgot it existed, dismantled an entire gang and saved a man the whole underworld was afraid of, stay with me. And if this is the kind of story that makes you feel something real, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, which meant the harbor district smelled the way it always smelled when it rained. Diesel, old fish, and something vaguely chemical that nobody from the city ever bothered to investigate. Leora Vale had been on her feet since 6 that morning. She was wearing her 3rd pair of non-slip shoes this year because the first 2 had given out, and this pair was already showing signs of going the same way. She was 24 years old. She looked younger than that when she smiled, which wasn't often, and older than that when she was tired, which was most of the time. The diner was called Patsy's, though no one named Patsy had owned it in 30 years. The current owner was a man named Gerald, who came in on Fridays to count the register and complain about the electricity bill. The staff was 3 people: Leora, a cook named Otis, who was 61 and had a bad knee and a worse temper, and a part-time waitress named Becca, who called out sick roughly every 3rd shift, and nobody pretended to believe her anymore. Tonight Becca had called out. Tonight it was just Leora and Otis. The Tuesday night crowd at Patsy's was not the kind of crowd that came for the food. The food was functional at best: eggs that arrived hot, coffee that arrived strong, pie that was honestly better than it had any right to be, given everything. The people who came to Patsy's on weeknights came because it was open, because it was cheap, because the booths were deep enough that you could have a conversation without the next table hearing it. A few came because Gerald, to his small credit, had never once cooperated with any of the 3 separate police requests to share information about his customers. Leora knew most of the regulars by their orders, not their names. Table 4 was a black coffee, and the chicken sandwich always, never deviated. The couple by the window were chamomile tea for her, and a Reuben he never finished. The old man in the corner, the one who came in every Tuesday and Thursday and always brought a folded newspaper, even though he never seemed to actually read it, was a slice of lemon meringue pie and water with no ice. She knew their habits. She knew when they'd arrived and approximately when they'd leave. She knew which booths had loose bench cushions and which ones the overhead light flickered, and at what time the back radiator started making that knocking sound that meant the kitchen was too hot. She knew the diner the way a soldier knows their ground. That knowledge would matter, sooner than she expected. He came in at 9:47. She noticed him because he came in through the rain without a jacket, which meant he either hadn't expected to be outside or had left somewhere in a hurry. He was tall, somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, with the kind of controlled stillness in his body that people either develop through discipline or through whatever experience teaches you to never look startled. He was pressing his left hand to his right side, low, near the ribs, casually, like he was just cold. He wasn't cold. She'd seen that gesture before, in a different life, and she knew what it meant. He sat in the last booth, the one nearest the kitchen door, the one where the overhead light had burned out 3 weeks ago and Gerald still hadn't replaced it. Whether he chose that spot deliberately or by instinct, she couldn't tell. Probably instinct. The kind of person who presses their hand to their ribs in a diner probably operates mostly on instinct. She brought him water without being asked. "Menu?" she said. "Coffee." His voice was even, controlled. He was in pain and working not to show it. Anything else? He looked at her for just a second, really looked, the way people rarely bother to look at waitresses, and then shook his head slightly. No, thank you. She brought her the coffee. She didn't ask about the blood she could just barely see on the hem of his shirt, dark against dark fabric. It wasn't her business. In this diner, almost nothing was her business, and that was an arrangement that had served everyone adequately for the 2 years she'd been working here. Otis had seen it too, she knew. She caught his eye through the kitchen window when she turned back, and he gave her the very small, very specific look that meant, I see it, and I'm not saying anything either, and then went back to his grill. For about 12 minutes, everything was almost fine. Then the door opened and Marcus Webb walked in. She knew his name because everyone in the Harbor District knew his name, the same way you know the names of certain weather systems. Not because you want to, but because not knowing them is a kind of dangerous ignorance. Webb ran the Hollow Kings, which was what happened when a street gang decided it wanted to be organized crime and didn't quite make it all the way there. They were violent in the specific, performative way of people who needed others to be afraid of them because fear was the only currency they'd ever accumulated. Webb was 29 and looked 39 and moved like someone who had decided a long time ago that consequences applied to other people. He had 6 men with him. She counted them without appearing to count them. Old habit, 6 plus Webb plus whatever was waiting outside, because there was always something waiting outside with men like Webb. He didn't look at any of the customers when he came in. He looked at the back of the diner. I was looking for someone. He was looking for the man in the dark booth. Leora was at table 6 refilling a coffee when Webb crossed the floor and stopped at the last booth. She kept pouring. She watched the coffee reach the rim of the mug and stopped exactly on time. Thought you could just walk away, Webb said to the man in the booth. Low, conversational, the worst kind of voice. After what you did tonight, thought you could just, get coffee? The man, the stranger, the one bleeding quietly in the dark, didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been when he'd ordered, even, controlled. You're making a mistake. I make mistakes all the time, Webb said. This isn't one. Then he turned his head and looked at Leora. She was already looking back at him. In the ordinary version of this moment, a waitress looks away, drops her eyes, makes herself small. That's not a failure of courage. That's the practical intelligence that keeps you alive when men like Marcus Webb are in the room. Look away. Become furniture. Let the moment pass. Leora did not look away. She wasn't sure later why she didn't. Some things you can't fully explain even to yourself. Maybe it was the 2 years of looking away at other things in other rooms that had used up whatever capacity she had for it. Maybe it was the child at table 3. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting with her grandmother, coloring in a paper placemat, who had gone completely still when Webb walked in and was staring with the very focused stillness of a child who has learned that adults are sometimes terrifying. Maybe it was just that she was tired. She'd been on her feet for 15 hours, and her shoes were giving out and she was tired. She looked at Marcus Webb, and she did not look away. Webb noticed. People like Webb always noticed. Noticing disrespect was a professional skill for them. He took 3 steps toward her. The 6 men behind him shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way armed people shift when the temperature in a room changes. You got something to say? Webb asked her. No, Leora said. Then put your eyes down. I'm working, she said. Simple, flat, not brave sounding, not defiant sounding, just a statement of condition. I am working. These are my eyes. They go where they need to go. Something moved across Webb's face. Not quite anger yet. More like the specific irritation of a man who has never been forced to think about how he treats people who refill coffee, now being forced to think about it. You know what I think? He said. He reached out and put his hand on the coffee pot she was still holding. He didn't grab it, just put his hand over hers on the handle. I think you need to kneel down and tell me you're sorry. The diner was silent now. All 23 people in it, even the grandmother at table 3 had stopped reaching for her granddaughter's crayon. Even the man in the dark booth had gone very still. I'm sorry, Leora said. Webb smiled. That you walked into my diner, she finished, and put your hand on my property. The coffee pot moved so fast that Webb didn't track it. She didn't hit him with it. That would have been stupid, would have started the violence before she was ready for it, and she was not ready yet. There were 23 people in this room who needed a few more seconds. She just moved it, pivoted the handle down and away from his grip in one clean motion, and stepped back to the counter and set it down. One of Webb's men started to reach for something. "Don't," Leora said. Not loud, almost bored. The exact tone Webb had used when he'd told her to kneel. The man actually paused. Webb stared at her. Something was working behind his eyes. She could see it. He was trying to figure out what kind of waitress did what she'd just done, and he was not coming up with a satisfying answer. "You're going to regret that," he said. "Probably," she said, "but not tonight." He moved toward her again, and this was the moment. This was when everything in the diner stopped being a tense situation and became something else. Because Webb was going to make an example, she could see it coming. And once he made an example of her, the 23 people in this room were going to be trapped in a room with a man making examples, and there was no knowing where that ended. She turned from him and addressed the room instead. Not loudly, not panicked. "I need everyone to get down," she said. "Under your tables. Now, children first." Then she walked to the front door and locked it. Webb almost laughed. "What are you doing?" She locked the back door. She stepped behind the counter. She met the eyes of Otis through the kitchen window. He'd come up close, watching, and she'd never seen him look exactly like that before. Some expression that sat between bewildered and something else she didn't have a word for. And she said, "Otis, close the kitchen window and stay down." "Leora, please." He closed it. She turned back to Marcus Webb and his 6 men. "Now," she said, "we can do this quickly, or we can do it slowly. One of those is going to hurt a lot more than the other. That's your choice." Webb's amusement had curdled into something uglier and more uncertain. He looked at the locked doors. He looked at this woman, thin, ordinary, wearing a faded uniform with a coffee stain on the left cuff. And something in him said, "This is wrong. This doesn't make sense." And because he had never been good at listening to that voice, he ignored it. "Take her," he said. The 2 men nearest her moved. What happened next lasted about 11 seconds. The first man reached for her shoulder, and she was not where her shoulder had been. She was lower, inside his reach, and she did something with her elbow that was not a theatrical move from an action sequence, but something much smaller and more deliberate. And the man's knee hit the floor so hard the sound of it made the grandmother at table 3 flinch. The second man grabbed at her from behind and found that she had used his own momentum to introduce his face to the edge of the counter. Not hard enough to end the conversation, just hard enough to change his vocabulary for the next several minutes. She was behind the counter again before either man had fully processed what had happened. 4 seconds of total silence. Then Webb's face went through approximately 5 distinct stages of expression before arriving somewhere dark and cold. "Who are you?" he said. It was the right question. It was also the question that the man in the dark booth was now asking himself, watching from the shadows with his hand still pressed against his ribs, and his coffee gone cold, and his understanding of what kind of night this was completely revised. Leora picked up the coffee pot, the original one, set it back on the warmer, turned to Webb. "I'm the waitress," she said, "who's going to give you one more chance to take your people and walk out the door." Webb didn't walk out the door. Of course he didn't. Men like Webb didn't walk out of doors they'd already decided to walk through. That wasn't how they worked, and part of her had known that, and the part of her that had known it had already been quietly cataloging. The gap between the counter and the first table, 3 feet. Not enough room for 2 people to move comfortably. The shelf behind her with its miscellaneous weight of ceramic mugs and the heavy glass sugar dispensers. The fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside the kitchen door, full. She'd checked it last week because it was on her checklist. The narrow gap between the booths near the window where even one person would create a bottleneck for anyone trying to move in numbers. She knew this room. She had made herself know this room, the same way she had made herself know every room she'd spent more than a week in, because in her experience, in the life she'd been building since she was 17 years old with nowhere to go and no one to call, knowing a room was the difference between being trapped and having options. She had options. Webb's remaining 4 standing men spread out. He was giving them silent directions with his eyes, the way organized people do, positioning them to come at her from multiple angles, which was tactically correct. and also the first real mistake he'd made since walking in, because spreading out meant they were going to get in each other's way in a space this narrow. The man in the back booth watched. His name was Dante Serrano. He had not said that to anyone tonight, obviously, because in his experience announcing yourself in a situation like this was how you died faster. But he was Dante Serrano, and he had been in more dangerous rooms than this one, and he had seen more violence than most people could describe. And what he was watching right now, this thin woman with the steady hands, cataloging the room around her without appearing to look at anything, calculating with her body rather than her face, was not something he had a category for. She moved when the first one was 3 steps away, not toward him, sideways into the gap between the first and second booth, drawing him into following, and when he followed, she was no longer in the gap, she was beside the booth, and the heavy ceramic mug she'd taken from the counter without anyone seeing her pick it up met his temple in a trajectory that was perfectly calibrated to stun and not to kill, because the last thing she needed was a body in here. And he went sideways into the booth, into the couple who'd been crouched there, and she said, "Sorry, he's going to be fine, just hold his head up," while she was already moving. The second came from her left. She went under his arm. She used his momentum in the edge of the table and something that looked, for a brief second, almost gentle, the kind of controlled contact that puts a joint under stress in exactly the right place. And he sat down on the floor with a very specific expression, the expression of someone whose body has just told them something shocking about their shoulder. "Stop moving that arm," she told him. Not cruel, informational. She kept moving. Webb had his gun out. That stopped everything. Guns always stopped everything, which was why people who didn't know what they were doing pulled guns as a first move. Webb knew what he was doing in the sense that he understood guns ended conversations, but he didn't know what he was doing in the sense that he'd now eliminated half his tactical options because you couldn't beat information out of someone you'd shot, and his original purpose in coming to this diner had been to find out what a certain man had told certain people before he died. He was pointing the gun at Lyora. She stopped. She looked at him. "Last chance," she said. And then she turned her head slightly and said it again, but this time she was looking at the dark booth. "For both of you." Webb followed her gaze. For the first time, he really saw the man in the last booth. The recognition landed on his face like something physical. His eyes changed. The gun shifted slightly, not toward Lyora anymore, but toward the dark. Toward the man he'd been hunting all over the harbor district for 3 hours. The man he thought was somewhere bleeding in an alley, not drinking coffee in a diner surrounded by civilians. "Well," Webb said softly. "There you are." Dante Serrano rose from the booth. His right hand was still pressed to his ribs. I was still bleeding, though slower now, probably clotting. He stood straight anyway, because it was not in him to stand any other way. And he looked across the diner at Marcus Webb with an expression Lyora had never seen on a human face before. Not anger, exactly. Not fear, exactly. Something older than both of those things. "Marcus," he said, "you should have taken the money and the year's head start I offered you." "You would have found me anyway," Webb said. "Yes," Dante said, "but you'd have been alive when I did." Webb cocked the gun. Lyora did not dive for cover. She did not freeze. She assessed the distance, 11 feet between Webb and Dante, herself at 9 feet from Webb, the angle not ideal but workable, the fire extinguisher on the wall at her 11 o'clock. And she did what she had trained herself to do in the handful of years when training was all she'd had to fill the space where a normal life should have been. She made a decision. She reached for the fire extinguisher. The fire extinguisher came off the wall in one pull. She didn't aim it at Webb. She aimed it at the space between Webb and Dante, the 11 feet of diner floor that was about to become a killing ground. And she pulled the pin and squeezed the handle, and the white cloud hit the room like a small explosion, cold and choking and total. Webb fired. The shot went wide. She heard it punch through the back wall somewhere above the pie display, and she was already moving through the white, through the cold chemical fog that tasted like chalk and metal, moving not toward Webb, but along the counter, low, using the cloud as cover the way you use terrain. Someone was coughing. Multiple someones. She heard a table go over, someone scrambling, someone panicking, and she heard Dante's voice, close, saying something sharp and clipped that she didn't catch. And then she came out of the fog on the far side of the counter, and she was behind Webb's left flank, and he didn't know it yet. She took him down. Not cleanly. She wanted to be clear about that. even just to herself, because the way it happened was not clean. He turned at the last second, faster than she'd expected, and the gun came around and she had to change what she was doing. Mid-motion, had to give up the controlled takedown for something messier, something that involved her forearm across his throat and her body weight, and the edge of the counter that he hit hard enough to make a sound she felt in her back teeth. The gun went across the floor. Webb grabbed her hair with one hand. She registered the pain as data, filed it, kept moving, and got his other hand on her throat, and for about 3 seconds they were locked together in a way that was not graceful and not cinematic, just two people at very close range trying to hurt each other badly enough to make the other one stop. She stopped him first. He went to the floor breathing, functional. She made sure he was functional, checked his eyes, checked his airway, because she needed him functional. She needed him able to talk, and more importantly, she needed the men outside to eventually believe he was still alive. Dead leaders created unpredictable vacuums. She knew what happened in vacuums. She stood up. Her left knee was not happy about something. She didn't look down at it. The diner fog was thinning. Through it, she could see the damage. 2 men still down from earlier, one sitting against the baseboard holding his shoulder, one in the booth still dazed, the 2 who'd been taken down in the first 11 seconds, still not fully operational. Webb on the floor. The last man, she counted. Where was the last man? Behind you, Dante said. She turned. The last man was 3 feet away with a knife, not a gun, which told her he'd either been disarmed already or had chosen the knife deliberately, and neither option was comforting. He was young, younger than the others, maybe 19, 20, with the wired, wide-eyed look of someone running on adrenaline and the specific terror of a night that had gone profoundly wrong. She raised her hands. Not surrender, calculation. You don't want to do that, she said. You don't know what I want, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. 19, probably, maybe younger. Your hands are shaking, she said. Not unkind, just accurate. That means part of you already knows this is over. Shut up. What's your name? Shut up. I'm asking because I want to know who I'm talking to, she said. Not because it matters for what happens next. You can put the knife down, or you cannot. But I want to know who you are first. Something flickered across his face. The kind of flicker that happened when someone unexpectedly became a person to a stranger in a situation where becoming a person was dangerous. Dayon, he said. Then, like he couldn't stop it, I wasn't supposed to. I know, she said. She didn't know. But she said it anyway because it was probably true in whatever way mattered. Dayon lowered the knife 3 inches. Just 3. But 3 inches was a concession, and concessions had physics. They tended to continue. Then Webb coughed from the floor and said, Don't you dare, Dayon. And Dion's jaw tightened and the knife came back up. Leora looked at Webb. Webb looked back at her from the floor, one eye swelling, the controlled viciousness in him banked but not extinguished, the kind of man who would lie in a pile of broken glass and still think he was winning. You don't run, he told Dayon. You hear me? You don't run from this. Leora turned back to Dayon. How long have you been with him? Don't answer her. 2 years, Dayon said, quietly, like it cost him something. 2 years, Leora said. And tonight he brought you here, to a diner full of people, to finish one man. And now look at this room. She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. How many of these 2 years have ended up like tonight? Dion's breathing had changed. It was slower now, which was either better or worse depending on what was happening in his head. The knife, Leora said. On the counter. Just lay it there. You can walk out the back and I will not follow you. She's lying, Webb said. I don't lie about exits, Leora said. Only about how hard the next few minutes are going to be. Dayon put the knife on the counter. Webb made a sound that was less like anger and more like grief, which surprised her. It surprised her enough that she looked at him, really looked. And for just a second she saw something she hadn't expected to see in a man like Marcus Webb. Something like a father watching a son make a choice he couldn't take back. And she filed that away somewhere complicated and moved on, because the diner was beginning to breathe again, people uncurling from under tables, the grandmother at table 3 saying something low and steady to the little girl who was pressed against her side. Dante Serrano was standing near the kitchen door, watching all of it. He was still pressing his hand to his ribs, but he'd straightened up in the last several minutes in the incremental way of a man who decides pain is an administrative problem rather than a physical one. His face was doing something she couldn't easily read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than surprise. She crossed to him, stopped 2 feet away, which was the distance she stopped from everyone, always. A distance she'd calibrated so long ago she no longer thought about it. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." "How bad is the bleeding?" He moved his hand slightly, looked down, pressed it back. "Manageable." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have," he said. Then, after a pause that felt like it meant something, "You should have left when the doors went locked." "I work here." "That's not why you stayed." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not." She stepped past him toward the kitchen door. "Otis, we're clear in here. I need the first aid kit, the full one under the sink, and I need you to call 911 and tell them we had a robbery attempt, multiple suspects, all contained, medical assistance needed for one GSW. That means gunshot wound." "I know what it means," Otis said through the closed window. "Otis." A pause. Then the window slid open and Otis was there, 61 years old with his bad knee and his worst temper, and he looked at the room, at Webb on the floor, at the men in various states of incapacitation, at the overturned table and the fire extinguisher residue still settling on every surface. And he looked at Leora and he said, "What in the hell?" "First aid kit," she said. "Please." "Who is he?" Otis said, looking at Dante. "Customer," she said. Otis disappeared. She heard cabinet doors. He came back with the kit and his phone already to his ear, talking to a 911 operator in the careful, deliberate voice of a man who had decided that whatever he'd just witnessed was something he was going to process significantly later. She took the kit to Dante. "Sit down," she said. I'm not asking," she said. "You're still losing blood, and I don't know how much you've already lost. And if you pass out on me in the next 10 minutes, this whole situation gets significantly more complicated. Sit." He sat. Not because she told him to, she didn't think, but because his body had been waiting for permission, and she'd given it. The careful, contained stillness in him relaxed by maybe 3 degrees when he sat down, just enough for her to see how much effort it had been costing. She opened the kit, cleaned her hands with the sanitizer packet, looked at the wound. It was a knife wound, not a bullet. Long and shallow at one end, deeper at the other. The kind of wound you got when you were moving, when the blade connected, when you turned into it or away from it and the geometry had gone sideways. Lucky in the way that knife wounds were ever lucky, which was a very limited way. "This happened before you came in," she said. "Yes." "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe more." She pressed gauze to it. He didn't react except for a slight tightening around his eyes. "Someone from your own people," she said. Not a question. A pause. "What makes you say that?" "Because Webb came here looking for you," she said. "Not for a fight. He wanted to find out what you knew and who you'd told it to before he killed you. That means he thought you'd be alone. That means whoever told him where you were also told him you wouldn't have backup." She pressed harder on the gauze. He breathed through it. "You were set up." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man confronting something he already knew but hadn't finished deciding to accept. "Yes," he said. "Do you know who?" Another pause. "I have a strong suspicion." "Is that suspicion currently in a position to finish what Webb started tonight?" He looked at her. The way he looked at her had changed. Not dramatically. Subtly, the way lighting changes in a room when a cloud moves. "You're very calm for someone who just fought 7 people." "I'm very tired," she said. Calm and tired look similar from the outside. She taped the gauze in place. "Can you stay upright for the next 15 minutes until the ambulance gets here?" "I'm not going to the hospital." She looked up at him. "I go to a hospital," he said. "They know I'm here. They know I'm hurt. Every decision I make in the next 48 hours becomes limited by what they can infer about my condition." He said it without drama, the way you'd explain a logistical constraint. "I'm not going. You have a deep knife wound. I've had worse." That's genuinely not reassuring. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "I have a doctor. My own. I'll contact him." "Your phone?" He checked his jacket. "Gone. Must have... during the ambush," she said. "Yes." She stood up, went behind the counter, found the landline. The diner still had a landline, Gerald's one concession to a previous era, and brought it to him. Make your call. Then I need you to be somewhere that isn't here when the police arrive, because I can't explain you and I can't explain why I know how to do what I just did. And if I have to explain both of those things to Chicago PD at the same time tonight, this situation becomes complicated, he said. Catastrophically complicated, she said. He took the phone. Dialed from memory. She noted that he dialed from memory, filed it, and spoke in short, clipped sentences to whoever answered. While he talked, she turned back to the room. The customers were emerging now from under tables and behind booths, the slow, careful emergence of people testing whether it was truly over. The grandmother had both arms around the little girl. The man from table 4, black coffee and chicken sandwich, was on his feet, looking at Webb on the floor, looking at Lyora, looking back and forth between these two things with an expression of complete incomprehension. Is everyone okay? Lyora asked the room. A woman near the window was crying quietly. An older man was standing very straight, the way older men sometimes stood when they were frightened and refusing to show it. A teenager near the door, she hadn't noticed him before, he'd been very still under the corner table, was staring at the two men she'd put down and recording something on his phone. Please don't post that, she said to him. He lowered the phone, then raised it again, then lowered it. He was working through something. Please, she said again, less command this time, something more honest. He put it in his pocket. Webb was trying to sit up. She watched him get his arms under him and push, slowly, the controlled movement of someone whose body was communicating things they were choosing not to listen to. He got to sitting, looked at her. You know this isn't over, he said. I know, she said. I've got 40 men on this block, maybe more by now. She'd known that, actually, since about the 4th minute. She'd heard the cars, 2 of them, at least, idling outside, engine sounds that hadn't moved. And Webb had been in here too long, long enough for whoever was waiting to start wondering. I know, she said again. So what's your play? He wasn't being threatening now. He sounded almost genuinely curious. You locked the doors. You took down my crew. You've got civilians in here and a man who half the city's trying to kill. What's your actual plan? She looked at him for a moment. Honest question deserves something close to an honest answer. I'm working on it, she said. He almost laughed. Caught it before it got all the way out, but almost. Dante finished his call, set the phone on the table. He looked at Lyora with the expression of a man who had just had a conversation that confirmed something he'd been afraid of, and was now deciding how much to carry alone. My people are 40 minutes out, he said. Webb says he's got 40 men outside. Webb is probably right. He said it without particular emotion. They'll be waiting for confirmation I'm dead. How long before they stop waiting and come in to check? Dante looked at Webb. Webb looked back at him with the wary, grudging respect of a man who had been outplayed once tonight and was trying to determine where the next game was starting from. 20 minutes, Webb said. Give or take. My second in command, he's cautious. He'll wait longer than most. 20 minutes, Lyora said. She did the math. The math was not good. 40 men with guns against 1 wounded man, 1 tired waitress, a cook with a bad knee, and 23 civilians in a locked diner with police maybe 10 minutes away. But no guarantee they came in force. No guarantee they came at all if someone had already called in a false report to draw them somewhere else. Webb's people were not disorganized. They had done this before. They knew how to manage police response times. Her left knee had graduated from unhappy to actively complaining, and she'd taken a hit to her right forearm during the takedown that was going to turn purple by morning. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to metabolize, that specific thinning in her legs, the slight tremor in her hands when she didn't have something to hold. She pressed both palms flat on the counter for a moment. 1 breath. 2. Otis was watching her through the kitchen window again. He had ended his 911 call. His face was doing something complicated. Lyora, he said. I'm fine, Otis. I wasn't going to ask if you were fine. She looked at him. I was going to ask what you need, he said. From the kitchen. What do you need? She looked around the kitchen visible behind him, saw what she always saw what it could be, given 20 minutes and 40 men who were going to stop waiting. The 2 cast iron pans, she said, the cable lock from the delivery door, every glass bottle in the condiment shelf, the vinegar, the oil, all of it, the box of kosher salt, and the thing under the 3rd burner. The starter fluid. Yes. Otis looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once and disappeared into the kitchen, and she heard drawers opening, heard the clatter of heavy pans. Dante was looking at her. What's under the third burner? Starter fluid for the emergency grill igniter, she said. Gerald bought it for hurricane season 3 years ago. Never used it. She moved around the counter. Go to the back hallway. There's an employee bathroom, small, no window, solid door. Take whoever needs medical attention. Your men outside, I'm assuming? 2, he said, waiting in a car half a block east. Can they walk? 1 can. Get them. Take them to the bathroom. And take... She turned to the room, raised her voice slightly. Anyone with children, anyone who has difficulty moving, anyone who is not able to handle what's about to happen outside, I need you in the back hallway. There's a storage room, heavy door, locks from the inside, right now, please. The grandmother moved. The crying woman moved. 4 others moved with them, including the teenager she'd asked not to film, who seemed to have decided somewhere in the last 5 minutes to put himself in the category of someone who followed instructions from Leora Vale. That left, in the main room, the older man who was still standing very straight, a man in his 50s who'd been at the counter and had not moved once during any of it, the man from table 4 who was looking at the situation with an expression of a person doing very serious internal calculations, and 3 others, 2 men and a woman, who had come out from under tables and seemed to be staying out deliberately. Leora looked at each of them. You're staying, she said. Not a question. They each nodded, separately. The woman last. She didn't ask their names, she didn't ask their histories. She filed them the way she filed rooms. By what they could do, by where they were, by what they could reach. Webb was still on the floor. He'd watched all of this with his swelling eye and his wiry, battered body, and now he said, You're going to try and hold the perimeter. I'm going to manage the entry points, she said. There's a difference. Not to the 40 men outside. There is to me. She looked at him. Are you going to be a problem? I'm cuffed to a radiator pipe, he said. She looked. He had in fact been cuffed to the radiator pipe near the front counter. She didn't remember doing that, but she must have, somewhere in the fog of the extinguisher and the knife and the gauze, with the zip ties from the drawer under the register that Gerald used for cable management. When did you... Dante started. Muscle memory, she said, which was the truth and also not an explanation. Webb pulled experimentally on the zip ties. They held. He settled back against the radiator with the careful posture of a man recalibrating. You know, he said, if you'd done what I said, knelt, apologized, said sorry, none of this would have happened. She was already moving toward the kitchen to take what Otis had assembled. She paused, looked back at him. Something would have happened, she said. It just would have happened to someone who couldn't stop it. She went to the kitchen. Outside, one of the idling cars had killed its engine. She heard it through the wall, the absence of sound, which was louder than the sound had been. She heard Dante, in the back hallway, having a clipped, low conversation with someone, his people, arrived from half a block east, making their way through the rear. She heard the older man at table 6 shift his weight from one foot to the other. She heard the little girl in the back storage room asking her grandmother a question in a small, steady voice, and she heard the grandmother answer it, and the answer was something Leora couldn't quite make out. But the tone of it was the kind of tone that meant, I am here, I am not afraid, everything is going to be fine, which was the best kind of lie because it was the kind people needed to hear even when it was a lie, and sometimes, if enough people said it steadily enough, it stopped being one. Otis was at the kitchen window, the 2 cast iron pans beside him, the rest of what she'd asked for in a box. You know, he said quietly, in 31 years of cooking, I have seen some things in this diner. I know, she said, I haven't seen this. No, she said, this is new. She took the box. Leora, he said. She turned. His face had arrived, finally, at that expression she hadn't had a word for earlier, and now she had a word for it. It was pride, complicated and uncomfortable. The kind of pride you felt for someone you realized you'd underestimated for 2 years without knowing you were doing it. You need me out there? She looked at his bad knee, looked at his face. 61 years old, every year of it showing. No, she said. I can... I know you can, she said. But I need someone in here who knows where everything is, and I need it to be someone I trust. She held his eyes for a second. That's you, Otis. He was quiet. Then, all right. She turned back to the diner. The man from table 4, black coffee, chicken sandwich, was standing near the window, looking out through the narrow gap in the blinds she hadn't told him to look through. 5 vehicles, he said. 2 SUVs, 2 sedans, 1 van. 3 people I can see standing outside the SUV nearest the entrance. More in the vehicles, can't count. He paused. They're getting out. She heard doors, the sound of boots on wet pavement, not running, moving with the specific unhurried confidence of numbers that knew they had time. Dante came back from the hallway. He moved differently than he had 20 minutes ago. Not better, necessarily. The wound was still the wound, but differently. The way a man moved when he'd stopped pretending a situation was manageable and started managing it. He looked at her. She looked at the box from the kitchen, at the 6 people left in the main room, at the 2 locked doors, at the fire extinguisher she'd already used, and the second one on the far wall she hadn't. She looked at the diner, 3 feet between the counter and the first table, the gap between booths, the bottleneck near the window, the heavy pie display case that could go across the door frame, the grease trap access panel in the floor, by the back table that she was fairly certain none of Webb's people would know existed. She looked at 40 men outside. She thought about the little girl in the back room asking her grandmother a question in a small, steady voice. Dante said, "Tell me what you need." And she told him. She told him everything, where to stand, where not to stand, what to do when the front door gave, and it would give, she said that plainly, she didn't pretend otherwise, and what to do immediately after. She told him in the flat, specific vocabulary of someone who had spent years learning how to make bad situations survivable rather than good, who had learned that the difference between those two things was preparation and the willingness to accept what a situation actually was rather than what you wanted it to be. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not question. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not this exactly," she said, "but something like it." She looked at the door, at the shadows moving through the blinds, at the rain still coming down outside, indifferent, as rain always was. "A long time ago," she said, "in a different place, someone I loved was in a room like this one. And I wasn't there. I wasn't ready, and I didn't know then what I know now." She reached into the box from the kitchen, lifted out one of the glass bottles, checked the weight of it, set it down. "So I learned." The window near the front shattered. Not a gunshot. Something thrown, something heavy going through the glass and landing on the floor and rolling, and she was already shouting, already moving, "Get down! Stay down! East wall! Now!" Because she'd expected this exact sequence, the thrown object first to create fear and confusion before the door breach. And she'd positioned the man from table 4 specifically for this moment, and he was already at the east wall the way she'd told him to be. The front door buckled, not open yet, just buckled. A single hard impact from outside that made the frame shudder and the lock hold barely, the way a lock held before it stopped holding. Webb, from the radiator pipe, said nothing. He watched. His face said he was revising something. The door buckled again. "Otis," Leora said, her voice even, carrying through the kitchen window. "Ready," Otis said. The door buckled a third time, and the lock gave. She was already moving when the first men came through, already in motion before the door was fully open, because, in her experience, the worst thing you could do when people came through a door was to wait until they were fully through it. The worst thing you could do was cede the initiative to the entry and the numbers and the momentum of the breach, and she had never been good at ceding things she didn't have to cede. 3 men in the door frame. She counted them in the half-second before contact the way she always counted, the way she could not stop counting any more than she could stop breathing. 3 men in the door frame, behind them the wet black street and the vehicles, and all the others waiting. Behind her, the grandmother's voice in the storage room, steady and low, still telling the little girl something. And somewhere in the gap between 1 second and the next, in the place where she'd stopped being a waitress, and hadn't yet become whatever she was becoming in the eyes of the man standing in the shadows behind her, Leora Vale went forward. The first man through the door was big. That was the first thing she registered. Not his face, not his weapon, but his size. The way he filled the frame, The way men who were large in doorways used that largeness as the first move, as a statement of intention before anything physical happened. She didn't let him finish the statement. She went low and left, inside his reach before he'd processed she was moving, and used the door itself, still swinging inward on its damaged frame, as a weapon, driving it back into the second man behind him, heard the impact, heard something that was probably a nose, kept moving. The first man grabbed at empty air where she'd been. She was already past him, using his momentum and his size against him the way you used a current instead of fighting it, redirecting rather than absorbing. And he went into the pie display case with enough force to crack the glass front panel. The third man in the doorframe had a gun up. The man from table 4 hit him from the side. Not gracefully, not with any training she could identify. Just hard, with the full weight of a mid-50s man who had decided in the last 10 minutes that he was done being a bystander, hitting the gunman at shoulder height and driving him sideways into the doorframe, and the gun discharged into the ceiling, plaster dust coming down like snow. "Get the gun," she said to nobody and everybody, already turning. 4 more men were coming through. She had perhaps 3 seconds before the numbers became mathematics she couldn't argue with. She pulled the first glass bottle from her apron. Oil, heavy. She'd loaded her apron pockets from the box Otis had assembled. She'd done it while she was talking to Dante, while she was giving instructions, her hands working independently the way hands did when the body had learned something deeply enough that it stopped needing supervision. She didn't throw it at the men. She threw it at the floor between them and the counter, and the oil spread fast on the linoleum, a slick dark pool in the path of their entry, and the second man through the door hit it at full stride and went down sideways and took the man behind him with him, and the crash of 2 large men hitting the floor simultaneously was loud enough that she heard it register in the storage room, heard the little girl make a sound that the grandmother immediately covered with her voice. The cast iron pan, Otis had left both of them on the pass-through, was in her hands before she'd consciously reached for it, and she used it the way you used it, not swinging it like a movie weapon, but working it like the blunt instrument it was. Short controlled strikes at specific targets, the kind of targets that stopped people without killing them. Because she was very clear with herself about that line, had been clear with herself about it since she was 17 years old, learning things she'd never wanted to learn, and she didn't intend to cross it tonight. 2 more down. The oil was a problem for the men coming in. It was also a problem for her, and she knew the edges of it, had calculated them when she'd thrown the bottle, and she moved inside those edges while the men behind her were still discovering where the edges were. Dante was at the east wall, doing exactly what she'd told him to do, not fighting, not exposing himself, managing the 2 men she'd positioned on either side of the gap between the second and third booths. He was directing them, quietly, efficiently, the voice of a man who was used to being listened to. And they were listening, even though he was a stranger, even though 5 minutes ago they'd been hiding under tables. There was something in his voice that made people organize around him. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, filed, noted, moved on. The older man who'd been standing very straight was at the window. She'd positioned him there to watch, to call what he saw, and he was calling it in a low, steady voice. 2 more coming from the van, 1 holding back near the vehicle. The SUV by the hydrant has someone in the driver's seat. "How many still outside?" she said between movements. 20, maybe more. They're not all showing themselves." 20. She'd taken down or incapacitated 7 in the initial push, but the door was open now, and the entry was compromised, and the oil on the floor was spreading thin and losing its effectiveness, and her left knee had stopped complaining and started refusing, which was different, which was the body saying, "This is not something I'm able to manage quietly anymore." She stood in the middle of the diner for 1 full second and assessed. The second cast iron pan, the starter fluid. She hadn't used it, didn't want to use it inside. The fire risk was the last thing she needed in an enclosed space with 23 civilians. The kosher salt, which she'd had a specific use for, that hadn't materialized yet. The second fire extinguisher on the far wall. The grease trap access panel in the floor by the back table. She'd mentioned the panel to no one, not even Dante. It was her reserve. It was the thing she held back, the option she kept until the moment when all the other options had been used up. Because in her experience, the only thing worse than running out of options was using them all at once and having nothing left when the situation changed. The situation was about to change. She knew it before she knew why she knew it, the way you sometimes felt the drop in atmospheric pressure before the storm arrived, something in the air going different before anything visible shifted. Then she heard it. Not from outside, from behind her. From the direction of the back hallway, where the storage room was, where the grandmother and the little girl and the others were locked in. A knock on the storage room door. From the outside. 3 knocks. Spaced. Deliberate. Not the sound of someone trying to get out. The sound of someone trying to get in from a direction she had not anticipated, had not mapped, had not accounted for. She went still. In 7 years of preparing herself for situations she hoped she'd never face, she had learned that the most dangerous moment was not the one you'd prepared for. It was the moment directly after the moment you'd prepared for, when you'd already spent your preparation and the situation kept going. She turned. Dante was looking at her. He'd heard it too. She crossed the diner in 11 steps, past the men on the floor, past the overturned furniture, past Webb, at the radiator who was watching her with an expression she couldn't read in the dark near the counter, and she went into the back hallway. The storage room door was closed, locked from the inside the way she'd told them. The knock came again, 3 beats. Then a voice, muffled by the door, male, low. "Leora, open the door." She stopped breathing for approximately 1 second. Nobody outside this building knew her name, nobody. She'd given no name to Webb or his men. She hadn't introduced herself. She'd been in motion since the moment this started, and in all of it, in all the chaos and the fighting and the negotiating, she had not once said her name to anyone who didn't already know it. Otis knew it. The regulars knew it. The people in this diner who had known her as their waitress for 2 years knew it. Nobody outside this building should know her name. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was level. She'd trained her voice to be level the same way she'd trained everything else. The same way she trained the tremor out of her hands and the fear off her face, because in her experience, the moment someone heard fear in your voice was the moment they started using it. A pause. Then, "Someone who's been looking for you for a very long time." The hallway was narrow. 1 overhead light, 40 watts. She had the cast iron pan in her right hand, and the second fire extinguisher from the kitchen Otis had pressed on her as she'd passed. She hadn't asked for it. He'd given it anyway, 61 years old with his bad knee and his better instincts, slung under her left arm. She took 1 step toward the door. "The people inside that room," she said, "are not part of this. Whatever this is." "I know, no," the voice said. "I'm not interested in them. I'm interested in you, and in the man you're currently protecting." Dante had come into the hallway behind her. She knew without looking. He made no sound. Whatever else he was not a man who made unnecessary sound. But she felt the change in the air that bodies made when they moved into a confined space. He stopped beside her. She looked at him. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. Something around the eyes had gone tight in a way that was specific. Not surprise, not fear. Something more precisely calibrated than either. He knew the voice. "You recognize it," she said. Quiet. Just for him. A muscle in his jaw moved. "Yes." "Who is it?" He looked at the door. He looked at it the way you looked at something you'd built that had started coming apart, with the specific grief of someone who understood the architecture of their own failure. "His name is Carver," he said. "He runs my Eastern operations. Has for 9 years. 9 years. She processed that. "The one who set you up." "I wasn't certain until now." "You're certain now." "Yes." She looked at the door. "How many with him?" "If Carver is here outside this building, then he didn't come alone." Dante's voice was careful, stripped of everything that wasn't information. "He has a crew that answers to him personally. 6, 8 men, separate from Webb's people." "So Webb was the front," she said. "And Carver's people were the contingency," Dante said, "in case Webb failed." She turned that over. Webb, who had 40 men and came in loud and was always going to lose because Webb's job was not to succeed. Webb's job was to exhaust, to use up resources, to draw out anyone protecting Dante, to identify the threat and the layout and the exits, so that when Carver's people came in through the back, through the angle she hadn't covered, they'd know exactly what they were walking into. She had been mapped. Everything she'd done in the last 40 minutes, every position, every improvised weapon, every person she'd moved and placed, had been watched and cataloged by someone who had used web as a probe the way you used a probe before a surgical strike. The nausea was brief. She didn't let it be anything more than brief. "Back door," she said. Not a question. She was already working backward through the layout. The back door, which she had checked, which she had confirmed was locked with the cable lock from the delivery entrance, which Otis had applied on her instructions. But Otis had then spent the last 40 minutes in the kitchen, and she had not confirmed the back door again, and she turned. She went past Dante, back through the hallway, into the kitchen. The back door was open. The cable lock was on the floor, cut, not unlocked, cut clean, with a tool that knew what it was doing. Otis was in the kitchen, and he was not alone. A man she'd never seen before had one hand on Otis's arm and something pressed to Otis's side, and Otis was standing very still with the careful, dignified stillness of someone who was 61 years old and had a bad knee and had decided that stillness was the correct response to the object being pressed into his ribs. The man was perhaps 50, with the lean economy of someone who had always stayed in shape not out of vanity, but because his profession required it. His face was arranged in something that was almost pleasant, the look of someone at a difficult business meeting they expected to conclude professionally. Carver. She knew it without introduction. The voice through the door, the presence in the kitchen, the 9 years of Dante's trust made flesh and standing with his hand on a 61-year-old cook's arm. "Put the pan down," he said to her. She looked at Otis. Otis looked back at her. His face was doing several things simultaneously, and the one she focused on was not fear exactly, but something more like apology. The specific expression of someone who believed they were the reason a situation had gotten worse. "Otis?" she said. "Are you hurt?" "Not yet," Otis said. "He won't be," Carver said, "if you put the pan down and step back." She did not put the pan down. She stepped back. One step, not more, which gave her slightly more room and changed her angle to the kitchen door, which she noted. "Where's the back door now?" she asked. Not Carver. The room in general. "Covered," Carver said. 4 men. 2 more on the roof access. 2 watching the east window where your elderly friend was giving you intelligence. He said it with the flat completeness of someone reciting a list they'd prepared. "You're very good. I want to say that. What you did out front, I've seen professionals with a third of that capability. You've been keeping yourself very well hidden." She said nothing. "The question I have," Carver continued, "is why? Why hide here? Why this diner, in this neighborhood, for 2 years? He tilted his head slightly. "What were you waiting for?" "I wasn't waiting for anything," she said. "Everyone's waiting for something," he said. "That's just the human condition." Dante had come into the kitchen doorway behind her. She heard his breathing, controlled even, but she could hear the effort in it now, the wound making itself known through the discipline. "Carver," Dante said. Carver looked past her. His expression didn't change, but something in it adjusted, the way a lens adjusted when the focal length changed. "Dante." 9 years, Dante said. 9 years, Carver said. "And 3 months, if we're counting." "Why?" The question was simple. No rage in it, no pleading. Just the word, bear. The way you asked a question when you actually wanted the answer and weren't sure you could tolerate it. Carver was quiet for a moment. The man who was not quiet was the kind who talked to fill silence because silence frightened them. Carver was not frightened by silence. He used it. "Because you don't have a successor," he said. "Because you've spent 9 years building something and you've given nobody a clear line of inheritance. Because one day, not tonight, I thought, but one day, you were going to make a decision about who came after you, and I realized 2 years ago that decision wasn't going to be me." He said it without self-pity. Informational. "So I made a different decision." Dante was quiet. "I'm not angry," Carver said. "I want to be clear about that. This isn't anger, this is logistics." She'd been watching Carver's hand on Otis the entire time. She'd been watching his weight distribution, which foot carried more load, how his elbow was angled, where the object pressed into Otis's ribs was actually positioned versus where it appeared to be positioned. She'd been watching all of it while Carver talked, because Carver was the kind of man who believed that talking was safe, that talking meant the situation was stable. And she'd known men like that before, and she knew that the stability was a function of control, and control could be interrupted. "What do you want?" she said. Carver looked at her, shifted focus back with the smooth, unhurried quality of a man who felt he had time. From you? Nothing personal. You're an inconvenience, a significant one, I'll grant you. I've revised my understanding of what an inconvenience looks like tonight, but still categorical. He paused. From Dante. I want the location of the files, the account documentation, the records he pulled from the internal servers 6 weeks ago that I've been unable to locate. Files, she said. The evidence of my 2-year restructuring of his Eastern operations, Carver said, which, yes, involved funds being moved in directions he hadn't authorized. He found out. I knew he found out. We've been playing a very quiet, very civil game of chess for 6 weeks, and tonight, he glanced at Dante. Tonight I decided chess was taking too long. The files are secure, Dante said. You won't get them. I'll get them, Carver said. The question is whether the cook suffers for it. She looked at Otis. Otis was looking at her. He had the expression he'd had through the kitchen window, the one that had taken her time to identify, and she identified it again now, and it still meant the same thing, and she felt the weight of it somewhere in her chest, somewhere not entirely professional. Don't, Otis said to her, quietly. Meaning, don't do whatever you're considering. Meaning, I've had a good life. Meaning, you are not responsible for my choices, and I am choosing to stand here. She heard all 3 meanings. She made her own choice. She threw the fire extinguisher, not at Carver. At the ceiling above the grill, where Otis's ventilation hood met the ceiling mounting, where the connection between the hood and the wall was bolted on one side, and where a large sudden impact would do something specific to the ventilation flap. She'd identified this 3 months ago during a routine cleaning, had noted it, had filed it the way she filed everything. And the extinguisher hit the mount, and the ventilation flap dropped, and the grill beneath it, which Otis kept on low during service hours, met the sudden influx of air from the flap, and the result was a flash of heat and light from the grill direction that was startling, dramatic, and temporary. It lasted 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough. In the shock and light, Carver's grip changed. Not released, changed. The slight reflex tightening that happened when something startled a person who was maintaining controlled contact. And the slight reflex tightening was not the same as deliberate force, and the thing pressed against Otis's ribs moved 1 inch in the confusion. Otis moved. Not dramatically, not fast. But Otis had been cooking in a dangerous kitchen for 31 years and had burns on both hands from a career of moving things out of the way of heat. And the thing he did with his left elbow was not a combat move. It was the move of a man who had spent 3 decades getting his body out of the way of things that could hurt him. And it worked because it was not the move Carver's training had prepared him for. 1 inch and 1 elbow and one old man's 31 years, and Carver's object came away from Otis's ribs. She was already there. What happened between the moment the object moved and the moment Carver was against the kitchen wall was something she could not have narrated in sequence, because it did not happen in sequence. It happened in the flattened time of trained reflex, the time that existed below thought, the time she had bought with years of early mornings in empty parking lots and late nights with materials she'd found and exercises she'd invented, and a kind of solitary, grim, purposeful practice that had never felt like anything other than penance. Carver was against the kitchen wall. The object, a compact, matte black thing that was most definitely a gun, was in her hand. Otis stepped away from him. He was breathing hard. He pressed his back to the counter and breathed. Carver looked at her. His almost pleasant expression had not entirely dissolved, but it had cracked, and through the crack she could see something genuine. He was frightened. Not of her specifically, she thought, but of the revision he was being forced to make, the revision to his map of the night, the discovery that there was something in this room he had fundamentally failed to account for. "Who are you?" he said. The same question Webb had asked her, an hour ago, a lifetime ago. "I told you," she said. "I'm the waitress." "No," he said. "You're not. You haven't been that since long before tonight." She pressed the gun to his throat. Not hard. Informational. "You're going to call your men off. I have 6 men outside this kitchen." "I know." "You can't." "I can," she said. "Call them off. Now. Tell them to stand down and pull back to the vehicles. Do it." He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation in his face was visible. She could almost see the columns, the weights, the variables he was running through. She let him run through them. She was not in a hurry. She was exhausted, and her knee was genuinely bad, and her right forearm had gone from purple to something she suspected was structural, but she was not in a hurry. "And then what?" he said. "And then I decide what comes next," she said. "That's not—" "Call them." He called. Short, specific, the voice of a professional giving an order he didn't want to give, but had decided was the tactical choice. And she listened to the order and listened to the confirmation in his earpiece, and she filed both sounds, the order and the confirmation, because something in the confirmation didn't sound right. She pressed slightly harder. "What did they say?" "Stand down," he said. "What did they actually say?" A pause. His eyes moved, just slightly, the involuntary direction of a gaze toward the thing being concealed. She heard the roof access. The sound of it was not a door opening. It was the opposite. The sound of a door that had been opened being closed from the outside, a deliberate closing, the sound of someone who had been on the roof coming inside rather than leaving. Not retreat. Entry. She'd forgotten the roof. She'd forgotten it because she'd been managing the front and the kitchen and the hallway and Carver and Otis and Dante's wound and 23 civilians, and the roof had been noted and filed as covered by Carver's assertion, and she had taken Carver at his word when she should have treated his words as what they were, information from an adversary, which was always also potential misdirection. She had made a mistake. The specific, particular nature of the mistake was available to her in a fraction of a second, and she took in the full shape of it with the speed of someone who had learned to absorb failure without getting stuck in it, because getting stuck in failure was fatal. And the one thing she had never permitted herself in 7 years was to get stuck. 2 men came through the ceiling access into the kitchen. Dante turned. One of them hit Dante. It was not elegant. It was not what trained people looked like. It was the specific, desperate efficiency of men who had been watching for 40 minutes and were frightened and angry and needed this to be over. And one of them hit Dante in the exact wrong place. The wound, the side, the gauze she'd taped over a hole that was already asking too much of the body around it. And Dante made a sound she had never heard from him before, had not thought him capable of. A sound that was the honest animal sound of serious pain after long controlled silence. He went down. Carver moved. She couldn't hold both. She had the gun, but she couldn't hold the gun on Carver and cross to Dante and deal with the 2 men from the roof access simultaneously, and Carver knew it, had probably planned it, had been waiting for the division of attention, and he went for the door with the speed of a man who had been coiling for 30 seconds. She made a choice. She let Carver go. She turned to Dante. The 2 men from the roof had their own weapons. She could see that, could see both of them, could see the geometry of it. And she did the only calculation the geometry allowed for, the calculation she hated making because it was the kind that worked on paper and felt like gambling in practice. She shot once, low, at the nearer man's leg, and then used the 2 seconds of his falling to get to the second man and do what she did with the cast iron pan in a situation with no remaining room for the kind of precision she preferred, which was to say, not much room at all. The second man stopped. The first man was on the floor. She'd done what she'd intended. The wound was there, he was down, he was not permanently damaged, and she moved from him to Dante without stopping. Dante was on the kitchen floor. He was conscious. She confirmed that first. He was conscious, his eyes open, his breathing rapid, his hand pressed back over the wound which had opened again, the gauze soaked dark. "I've got you," she said. "Carver, I know." He's going to the— "I know," she said. "Look at me. Look at me right now." He looked at her. "You're bleeding again. The wound reopened. I need you to stay still and stay awake while I—" "There are more of them," he said. "Outside. Carver is going to regroup, and there are more of his people outside, and Webb's people are still there, and you cannot—" "I know," she said, for the 3rd time. The words were starting to feel like something other than information. "I know." "You can't do this alone," he said. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had spent the last hour revising his understanding of what she was, who lay on the floor of a kitchen that smelled like cast iron and coffee and the specific metallic edge of the fire extinguisher residue, with his hand pressed over a wound that was telling her something about time limits she didn't want to hear. "Your doctor," she said. "The one you called. How far out?" 40 minutes? Maybe 30 now." 30 minutes, she calculated. Carver, regrouping. Webb's remaining people outside. 6 of Carver's men who had been called off once and would not stay called off now. No more weapons she'd planned for. The roof access now an open entry point, the front door compromised, the stored room holding civilians who had been in there for 50 minutes and were going to start making noise whether or not she told them not to. Otis lowered himself to the floor beside Dante with a first aid kit she hadn't known he'd kept in the kitchen. His bad knee made the lowering slow and deliberate, and he didn't complain about it once. Pressure, she told him. Both hands. Don't move them. I know how to do pressure, Otis said. I've had cuts in this kitchen you would not believe. She stood. She looked at the 2 incapacitated men from the roof, looked at the open ceiling access, looked at the gun in her hand that had 1 round remaining and approximately 30 heavily armed problems outside who were no longer waiting for instructions. Then she heard it. From the main diner, from the direction of the storage room, the voice she'd been listening for and dreading since Carver had knocked on that door in the hallway. Not the grandmother's voice, not the steady, controlled voice of an older woman telling a small child that everything was fine. A child's voice, high and clear, the way frightened children's voices were high and clear, cutting through everything else. There's a man, the little girl said, from somewhere in the direction of the storage room that was supposed to be locked from the inside. He has a gun and he's holding my grandma. Leora went cold. Not from fear. Fear would have been easier. What she went cold from was the specific sensation of understanding that the situation had moved outside the boundary of what she had prepared for, outside the edge of what she knew how to manage, into a territory she had spent 7 years building herself to avoid. She walked out of the kitchen, into the hallway, into the diner. The storage room door was open. A man she didn't recognize, one of Carver's, she assumed, someone who had come in through an angle she'd missed, through the roof or through a window or through a crack in her arithmetic, had his arm around the grandmother's shoulders and something pressed to her temple. The little girl was standing 3 feet away from her grandmother, which was the distance she'd been pulled to, and she was standing very still with the focused stillness that Leora had noticed earlier, the stillness of a child who had learned that adults were sometimes terrifying. The man looked at Leora. Put it down, he said, meaning the gun. Or I do something we both regret. Leora looked at the grandmother. The grandmother looked back at her with an expression that said several things in rapid succession, and the last one, the one underneath all the others, was the same thing Otis's face had said in the kitchen. I am choosing to stand here. That is my choice. You did not make it for me. She looked at the little girl. The little girl looked at her with the dark, serious eyes of someone 6 years old who had not yet learned how to be afraid of the wrong things, which meant she was afraid of the right things, which meant she was afraid of the man with his arm around her grandmother and the thing pressed to her grandmother's head. Leora set the gun on the floor. She straightened up. She looked at the man. She had no cast iron pan. She had no fire extinguisher. She had no glass bottles of oil or kosher salt or starter fluid, or improvised position or prepared ground. She had her hands and her body and 7 years of learning how to survive in rooms that wanted her dead. And she had approximately 12 feet between herself and a man with a hostage, which was 12 feet. She counted it the way she counted everything. Not with her eyes, with her body, the way distance lived in the legs and the shoulders, and the exact calibration of how many steps before contact, how many before the geometry changed enough to matter. The man with his arm around the grandmother was watching her set the gun down, watching her straighten up. His eyes were doing the thing eyes did when they believed they'd won something. A slight loosening, a slight expansion, the microscopic relaxation of someone who had been prepared for resistance and received compliance instead. That loosening lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. She was moving on the second, not at him, at the space beside him, the angle that put her outside the natural arc of his weapon arm, the angle that the grandmother's own body created. Because the grandmother, in the 3 seconds since Leora had put the gun down, had done something very small and very deliberate that Leora had registered and catalogued. She had shifted her weight slightly forward on her left foot, which meant she was ready, which meant she had understood something from watching Leora work in this diner for the last hour that translated in an instant into cooperation without words. Leora hit the 12 feet in 4 steps. On the 3rd step, the man started to react. On the 4th step, the grandmother dropped her weight straight down, the way you dropped when you'd been told all your life to go limp. the instinct of someone who had survived things by knowing when to make themselves small and heavy. And the man's arm came with her for one critical fraction of a second before his grip adjusted, and that fraction was the opening. The contact was fast and ugly and not clean. She'd stopped expecting clean about 40 minutes ago. His weapon discharged. She heard it, felt the pressure change near her left ear, registered the sound as past and therefore survivable, kept moving. And she had his wrist and his elbow, and the specific relationship between those two joints that she could manipulate in ways that made size irrelevant, and she used that relationship until the weapon was on the floor and the man was following it. She put her knee on his back, hard, her bad knee. It told her in extremely clear terms what it thought of this. She stayed there anyway. Don't, she said to him, flat, spent. She was running out of words and had been for a while. Just don't. He didn't. The grandmother was on her feet before Leora looked up, standing straight, both hands smoothing the front of her coat, with the automatic gesture of someone restoring order to their appearance, because restoring order somewhere was necessary when everywhere else was chaos. She looked at Leora. Is she? Leora started. I'm fine, the grandmother said. Her voice was very steady. Eleanor May Hutchins, 72 years old. I've had worse evenings. She looked at the man on the floor. Not many, but some. The little girl crossed the 3 feet between them and put her arms around the grandmother's waist without saying anything, the wordless, full-body claim of a child reattaching to the person who was safety. Leora stood up from the man on the floor. Her knee had gone past pain into something that felt like information delivered via fire. She put her weight on it anyway, bent down and picked up the gun. The man's gun, not hers. Hers was on the floor 6 feet away, and she picked that up too, checked it with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done it enough times that checking guns was like checking doors, something you just did. 2 guns. 1 round remaining between them, and the one she'd fired in the kitchen. She stood in the middle of what had once been a functional diner and was now a crime scene waiting for investigators. And she did the only calculation that mattered. Carver was outside. Regrouped. His remaining people, however many that was, she'd lost accurate count in the last 20 minutes, were outside. Webb's people, the ones who hadn't run, were outside. Dante was in the kitchen bleeding through his second round of gauze. Otis was with him. Her knee was bad enough that running was theoretical. She had 2 guns with a combined total of 1 round. And outside this building, it had stopped raining. She didn't know why she noticed that. The rain had been constant since before all of this started, and now it had stopped. And the absence of it was startling in the way that silence was always startling after sustained noise. And she stood in the ruined diner and heard the city in the wet quiet that followed rain. And for approximately 3 seconds, she allowed herself to be just a person standing in a room. 3 seconds. Then she moved. She went back to the kitchen. Dante was sitting up. This alarmed her and also did not surprise her. He was sitting up against the cabinet with Otis's hand still pressed to his side, and the expression of a man who had made a decision about what his body was going to do, regardless of what his body had opinions about. Carver's outside, she said. I know. Your men, the 40 minutes. Where are we? He looked at his watch. The watch was expensive and simple, the kind of watch that just told time, and he looked at it with the focus of someone doing math they didn't like. 15 minutes, maybe. Maybe isn't. I know, he said. She looked at the ceiling access. Still open. She looked at the back door, still open. She looked at Otis. I need you to go to the storage room, she said. Take Eleanor, the woman, the grandmother, her granddaughter, everyone who's in the hallway. Go back in and lock it again, and do not open it until you hear my voice. Only my voice. Leora, Otis. He looked at Dante. Something passed between the 2 men, the look of 2 people assessing a third party and arriving at the same conclusion by different routes. All right, Otis said. He took his hands off Dante's side. He replaced them with Dante's own hands, pressing down, resetting the pressure. He got to his feet with the slow, groaning effort of a 61-year-old man who had been on a kitchen floor, and he went. She waited until she heard the storage room door close, heard the lock. She looked at Dante. Can you stand? She said. Yes. Don't lie to me. I'm not. He looked at her. I haven't lied to you once tonight. She thought about that, realized it was true. Okay, she said. Then stand up. He stood up. It cost him. She could see exactly what it cost. The whitening around his mouth, the rigid control of breathing, the way he anchored his right hand against the cabinet and used it as a lever rather than admitting his legs needed a moment. He stood. She handed him the gun with the remaining round. He looked at it, looked at her. I have two, she said. You take the loaded one. You keep it, he said. I don't need it, she said. I need you to be able to defend the kitchen door if someone comes through the roof access while I'm outside. You're going outside, he said. Yes. Leora. The way he said her name was different from how anyone else had said it tonight. Not the voice through the storage room door that had been a tool, her name as a key to unlock a response. This was something else, something that recognized she was a person in addition to being a tactical situation. You've been on your feet for— Don't, she said. Not unkind. I know what I've been on my feet for. I know what my knee is doing. I know how many people are outside, and I know what I have left to work with. She met his eyes. I also know that if Carver regroups and comes back in with the people he has left, this room ends badly. And there is a 6-year-old girl in the storage room and a 61-year-old man with a bad knee who has been putting pressure on your wound for the last 20 minutes, and I am not willing to let this room end badly. He was quiet. Take the gun, she said. He took it. She turned to the back door, looked out into the alley. Wet pavement, the smell of rain and dumpsters, and the particular odor of Chicago in August after weather. The alley lights throwing orange pools on the slick ground. Nobody visible. Nobody visible meant either Carver's 4 men had actually stood down, or they were standing somewhere she couldn't see them, and both of those possibilities had to be treated the same way because the cost of being wrong was the same. She went out the back door. She moved along the wall, her left side to brick, her right side to darkness, moving the way she'd taught herself to move in the years when moving this way was the difference between being found and not being found. Slow. Low pressure on the bad knee. Listening. The alley ran between the diner and the next building, then opened onto the side street that connected to the main street out front. She could hear voices from the direction of the main street. Not words, just the low, collective, purposeful murmur of a group of people who were waiting for something. The sound of organization. The sound of Carver. She reached the corner of the building, pressed her back to it, breathed. Around this corner was the side street. Around the side street was the main street. On the main street were whatever remained of Webb's people and Carver's people, reorganized under Carver's direction, preparing to come back in for what Carver had decided was a surgical second attempt. She thought about the gun she'd given Dante. 1 round. She thought about her own 2 empty guns, which she was carrying because empty guns looked like guns, and looking like a gun was its own kind of useful, in the dark, at distance, for the specific second between when someone saw you and when they realized. She thought about the kosher salt. She had taken it from the box when she'd loaded her apron pockets, back in what felt like a different era of the night. She still had it. A cardboard cylinder of kosher salt, the kind used on the kitchen line, heavy, almost full. She'd had a specific use for it that had never materialized. She filed that away and looked for the use that fit the situation she was actually in, rather than the one she'd planned for. She went around the corner. The first man saw her immediately. He was posted at the junction of the alley and the side street, Carver's man, she assessed, from his positioning and his equipment, not Webb's style. And he came up with his weapon, and she was already doing 2 things simultaneously, holding up both empty guns so that at 10 feet in bad light they looked like what they were supposed to look like, and talking. Carver said to pull you back, she said. Flat, professional. The voice of someone delivering a message they hadn't asked to carry. The man hesitated. He hesitated because the instruction was plausible. Carver had called a stand-down earlier. Carver was reorganizing. Receiving a pullback instruction from someone walking out the back of the building was not impossible. And because the 2 guns she was holding made her look like someone who was on the same side as someone. And because hesitation was the thing you got from people who were waiting for orders and had just received what sounded like one. She covered the 10 feet while he was hesitating. She hit him once, precise, the heel of her left hand to the jaw, the kind of hit that put a man down without doing permanent damage, and he sat down on the wet pavement with an expression of complete disorientation. She took his radio, his weapon, his phone. She looked at the phone. Unlocked. People in operational situations kept their phones unlocked. She found the recent calls, found a number labeled simply C. She dialed it. It rang twice. "What?" Carver said. "It's me," she said. A pause. Brief. Then, "I see." The almost pleasant tone had returned, which told her he'd had time to regroup internally as well as tactically. "You came outside." "I thought we should talk," she said. "I don't think talking serves either of us at this point." "I think it does," she said, "because you want the files and I know where they are." The pause this time was longer. "Dante told you," he said. "Dante didn't have to," she said. "You told me when you described what you were looking for. Account documentation. Records of fund movements over 2 years. The kind of records that don't live on a network. They live on physical media, because someone who is moving money without authorization wouldn't store the evidence of that on a system his employer could access." She looked at the side street, at the shapes of people in the dark. "It's a drive. Physical. Dante's been carrying it or had it close to him since he pulled the record 6 weeks ago. Because he's been trying to decide what to do with it. Because you worked for him for 9 years and part of him—" She stopped. Started again. Part of him didn't want it to be true. Silence on the line. "I want to make a trade," she said. "You have nothing to trade," Carver said. "I have the drive," she said. She didn't have the drive. She had approximately zero confirmation that the drive existed in the form she'd described, or that Dante had it, or that it was anywhere near this building. She was making a structural argument. If X is true and Y is true, then Z is probably true, and presenting it as knowledge, which was a lie, which was the thing she'd told Dante she didn't do. And she noted the contradiction and moved through it because the situation she was actually in did not leave room for consistency. "Prove it," Carver said. "I don't prove things over a stolen phone to a man I can't see," she said. "You want the drive. I want your people off this block, all of them. Webb's too, if you've absorbed his command structure, which I believe you have, because Webb's people stopped making independent decisions about 20 minutes ago and started doing what yours were doing." She heard something in the silence that was consideration. Real consideration, not the performance of it. "If you have the drive," Carver said, "then you have something Dante gave you, which means Dante trusts you, which means I need to understand what you are to him before I agree to anything." "I'm the waitress," she said. "Stop saying that." "It's true," she said. "It's entirely true. Whatever else I am, I work in that diner for $8 an hour plus tips, and my tips are not good, and I have a lease on an apartment 6 blocks from here that I pay with what I make from the diner. And in 2 years, the most remarkable thing that's happened to me in this neighborhood is the pie recipe improved." She kept moving as she talked, tracking the positions of the shapes in the dark, counting. "I'm nobody. That's the point. I've been nobody for a very long time on purpose." "On purpose?" Carver said. "Why?" She didn't answer that. "Because someone was looking for you," Carver said. Not a question. "Someone was looking and you made yourself unfindable, and you chose this neighborhood because it was the kind of neighborhood where nobody looked too carefully at a waitress who kept her head down." Another pause. "Leora. That's not a common name." She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, something colder than fear. "Are you former government?" he said. "Military?" "Because what I've had described to me from the men inside that diner." "Trade," she said, cutting him off. "The drive for your people off this block. That's the only conversation I'm having." "And Dante?" "Dante is not part of the trade. He's the reason for all of this." "I know," she said. "He's still not part of the trade." She heard him breathe once. "The drive delivered to me personally, in my hand, in the next 10 minutes, and I pull every person off this block." "You pull every person off this block first," she said. "Then the drive." "That's not—" "You've had 3 separate opportunities tonight to end this cleanly," she said. "You used Webb as a probe, which was smart. You came in through the back, which was very smart. You put a man in the storage room with a grandmother, which was effective and also tells me everything I need to know about what you're willing to do." She let that sit for one beat. "I'm done negotiating terms that depend on trusting you to honor them after you have what you want. Your people pull back first, all of them. Then we talk about the drive." A long silence. Then she heard it, the sound from the direction of the main street, The sound of people moving, vehicles starting, the collective shifting of a group responding to an order. She watched the shadows change, watched shapes become fewer, watched the orange-lit pavement of the side street become emptier in the slow, verifiable way that meant it was real and not staged. They were pulling back. Not all the way. She wasn't naive enough to believe all the way, but back enough that the immediate tactical picture had changed, back enough that the block in front of the diner was no longer a shooting gallery, back enough to mean that the 15 minutes until Dante's people arrived might actually be survivable. She walked back to the alley, back to the back door. Inside. Dante was where she'd left him, standing against the cabinet, the gun in his right hand, his left hand pressed to his side, his face the color of something that had been through too much and was deciding whether to continue being conscious about it. Carver pulled back, she said. He looked at her, looked at the radio and the stolen weapon and the phone in her hands. What did you tell him? He said. That I had the drive, she said. A silence. You don't have the drive. No, she said. You lied to him. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That buys us time, not much. 12 minutes, she said. Maybe. My people will be here. They need to be here in 12 minutes, she said. He looked at her with the expression he'd been developing across the last hour, the expression that was still being revised, the expression of a man who had started the night believing he understood the range of things that existed in the world and was being systematically shown that the range was larger than he'd mapped. The drive exists, he said. You were right about the form. Physical media. I have it. I don't need to know that, she said. You made a trade on its behalf, he said. You should know it's real. What I need to know, she said, is whether your people are going to be here in 12 minutes, because Carver is not a man who waits quietly, and the moment he decides I lied to him, which he probably already suspects, whatever restraint the prospect of the drive was purchasing us ends. 10 minutes, Dante said. He said it with the quiet finality of someone who had just checked something internal rather than external. Not a watch, not a calculation, just the certainty of a man who knew his people. 10 minutes. She looked at him, at the gauze darkening again beneath his hand, at the cabinet he was leaning on, at the gun she'd given him, held with the economy of someone who had held guns before but did not wave them around, the specific grip of someone who knew what it cost to fire one. Sit down, she said. If Carver, I'll hear Carver, she said. Sit down. He sat. Not because she told him to, she thought again, but because his body had voted and the vote was no longer negotiable. She went to the pass-through, found the first aid kit again, went back, knelt beside him, her bad knee communicating its feelings with the full intensity of something that had been ignored for too long, and started working. There's something I want to ask you, he said, while she worked. Then ask it. 7 years, he said. That's how long you've been doing whatever you've been doing. However you know what you know. Whatever you trained for or were trained for. He watched her hands. Something happened 7 years ago. Something that started this. She didn't look up from what she was doing. You said someone you loved was in a room like this one, he said. And you weren't there, and you weren't ready. Her hands kept moving, steady. She'd trained the steadiness into them, and it was reliable now. Mostly, it was reliable now. Who was it? He said. She looked up at him. He looked back. Not demanding, not pressing. Just asking, with the directness of someone who had decided that direct was the only thing left worth being. My father, she said. She hadn't said those two words in that order to anyone in 7 years. She'd said my father in her own head, countless times, in the specific late-night conversations you had with yourself when the apartment was quiet and the training was done for the day and there was nothing left to do but be a person. But not out loud. Not to anyone. She looked back down at the gauze. He ran a restaurant, she said. Not like this one, a real one, good one. He'd built it himself in a neighborhood a lot like this neighborhood. The kind of place where people thought they were getting just food and were actually getting looked after without knowing it. She pressed the gauze flat. The people who ran the street around that restaurant decided they wanted a percentage. My father said no. They sent people. Not once. A few times over a few months, the way people like that tried to wear you down before they stopped trying and just finished it. Her voice was even. She'd trained her voice. The last time, they sent more people than he was ready for. And I was 17 and I was 3 blocks away, and I didn't know until after. She taped the gauze down, checked the edges. I'm sorry, he said. I know, she said. That's why you refused to kneel, he said. Not a question. She looked up at him again. I refuse to kneel because I don't kneel, she said. That's all. The rest of it, the training, the last 7 years, that's not about tonight. Tonight was just a Tuesday. Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile again, but the same neighborhood as before, the same memory of one. This, he said, was not a Tuesday. No, she agreed. It was not. She stood up. Her knee made its position known through every layer of her awareness, loud and specific and absolutely without nuance. She stood on it anyway. From the front of the diner she heard something. She went still. Not the sound she'd been dreading. Not Carver's people coming back through the front door. Something else. A voice. Webb's voice, carrying from the front of the building where he was still zip-tied to the radiator pipe. She crossed the kitchen, into the hallway, into the diner. Webb had gotten to a different position against the radiator. He'd worked himself around so his back was to the counter and he was facing the front of the diner, and he was talking. Not loud, not to anyone in the room, she realized, but to the radio clipped to his collar, the one she hadn't taken because she hadn't known it was there, the one that had been against the wall side of him the entire time. She crossed the diner in 6 steps and got her hand on the radio. Webb looked up at her. Something in his face was not what it had been before. Before, his face had been calculating. This was different. This was the face of a man who had just learned something. Too late, he said. Already told them. Told them what? She said. Carver's location, he said. She stared at him. I've been listening, Webb said, to your conversation with him. On that radio you took from my man in the alley. I could hear both sides. He held her gaze. I know where Carver is, and I just told what's left of my people. She looked at the radio in her hand, looked at Webb. Why? She said. Because Carver used me, Webb said. It came out flat, and underneath the flat she could hear something that was not quite anger and not quite shame, but lived between them. 40 men I put into this tonight. On his word that Dante was isolated, that it was clean, that there was money waiting when it was done. He pulled once on the zip ties. Not to escape, just to feel them. He didn't tell me about you. He knew about you, she said. He'd been watching this neighborhood, but he didn't tell me. Sent me in blind. His jaw tightened. I don't like being sent in blind. She looked at him. Your people knowing where Carver is, she said. What does that get me? Carver has 6 men left, Webb said. Maybe 8. My people have numbers. Different kind of problem all of a sudden, for a man who just ran out of leverage. She calculated. Webb's people turning on Carver complicated the picture in ways she hadn't planned for but could work with, could work around, could use. If Webb's people were actually moving, if this wasn't its own layer of misdirection, if she could trust anything Webb said, which was a question she didn't have a clean answer to. Why are you this? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. My people, he said. When you had me, when you could have just finished it, you made sure my people were functional, the ones you put down. You checked them, made sure they were breathing. He said it without any particular effect, just observation. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said. My cousin's kid, he said. Dion, the boy with the knife. He looked at the front of the diner, at nothing in particular. You let him walk. She waited. I'm not saying we're even, Webb said. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying Carver used me. And you didn't when you could have. That's the whole of it. She absorbed that, filed it. From outside, from the direction of the front of the building, from the dark, wet street that smelled like rain that had stopped, she heard sounds that were not Carver's people and were not the last remnants of Webb's. Sounds that were new and organized and arriving in the specific configuration of people who knew what they were walking into. Dante's people. She turned toward the door. They came in the way. Dante's people came in. Not loud, not dramatic. 8 men who moved like they'd been doing this for longer than she'd been alive. Who took the room in one sweep and established positions in under 4 seconds and then stood down when they identified that the room was not a threat. The controlled, fluid entry of people who were very good at their work. The one in front was about 45, with the weathered look of someone whose job had been spent outdoors in all kinds of weather. He looked at the diner. He looked at Webb at the radiator. He looked at the two men still down on the floor. He looked at Leora. "Where is he?" said. "Kitchen," she said. He went to the kitchen. She didn't follow. She stood in the middle of the diner and let her weight settle on both feet, and her left knee sent her a message that was essentially a resignation letter, and she received it and decided to address it later. She looked at the diner, at the fire extinguisher residue still coating every surface, at the pie display case with the cracked front, at the overturned table, the broken window, the gouge in the plaster from Webb's shot an hour ago, at the man at the radiator who had tried to make her kneel and who had, in his own complicated way, decided which side he was on when it mattered. She went back to the kitchen. Dante was on his feet. He'd stood up when his people came in, because he was not a man who was found sitting on a floor by his own people, and she understood that, found she didn't argue with it. The man from outside was beside him, the compact competence of someone who had years of experience managing exactly this category of situation, and he was looking at the wound with the focused assessment of a professional. "Serious but manageable," the man said. He looked at the gauze. "Who did this?" "She did," Dante said. The man looked at her. "Twice," Dante said. The man looked at the gauze more closely, then looked at Leora with an expression that shifted from assessment to something more complicated in about 3 seconds. "All right," he said, "we need to move him." "Carver," Dante said. "He's still—" "Handled," the man said. "We've had eyes on Carver for 6 weeks. Tonight gave us a location and a justification." He said it with the quiet satisfaction of someone clearing a task from a list. He's not a problem that exists anymore. Dante absorbed that. Something moved across his face. Relief, maybe. Or the complicated thing that lived in the same neighborhood as relief, when the threat that was removed was someone you'd trusted for 9 years. "The civilians," Dante said. He looked at Leora. "Your people inside." "Storage room," she said to the man. "Back hallway. A cook named Otis, a grandmother named Eleanor, her granddaughter, and 4 others. Everyone is intact." The man nodded. "Sent 2 of his people with a word." Dante looked at her. She looked back at him. Around them, the kitchen was doing what kitchens did after crises, existing in the aftermath, in the strange, detailed stillness of a space that had been through something and was now just a kitchen again. The grill cooling, the overhead light buzzing its usual slight buzz, the smell of everything that had happened layering over the smell of whatever Otis had been cooking before all of it began. "My people will secure the block," Dante said. And then the police are coming," she said. "I had Otis call them 20 minutes ago. They're going to be here." He nodded. He'd expected that. "I'll need to manage that conversation." "Yes," she said. "You will." "And you?" He started. Webb's voice came from the diner. Not loud, just carrying, the way voices carried in an empty room. "Someone's going to need to explain to me how I'm getting out of this radiator before the cops show up, because I am not doing this night in zip ties." She almost laughed. It didn't make it all the way out, but it came close, and the almost laugh did something to her face that was probably visible, and she was too tired to care, and Dante saw it, and something happened in his face in response that was the same kind of thing, the same, not quite, that came from being too tired to maintain the performance of not feeling what you were feeling. "I'll get him loose," she said. She turned toward the diner. "Leora," Dante said. She stopped. She turned back. He was looking at her with the expression that had been developing all night, the one still being built. And it was complete enough now that she could see what it was. It was the look of someone who had revised their understanding of the world in a fundamental way and was still in the first moments of living in the revised version. "Why did you stay?" he said. "Not why in general. Tonight specifically. You had options. You could have gone through the back before Carver arrived. You had routes. I watched you. You always knew the exits. Why did you stay?" She looked at him. She thought about the little girl at table 3, coloring on a paper placemat with the focused seriousness of a child making something. She thought about Eleanor May Hutchins, 72 years old, who had dropped her weight when she needed to without being asked. She thought about Otis and his bad knee, and his 31 years of burns, and his first aid kit that he'd kept under the cabinet, because he was the kind of man who kept a first aid kit under the cabinet. She thought about a restaurant in a neighborhood like this one, and a man who had built it, and a Tuesday night when she'd been 3 blocks away. Because someone needed to, she said. She went back to the diner. The radiator was in the corner by the front counter, and Webb was against it, looking up at her with his swelling eye and his wiry, battered everything. And she crouched down and looked at the zip ties and looked for the angle that cut them without a blade, the specific stress point in the plastic that you could work with the right amount of targeted force. And she found it, and she worked it until the ties gave. Webb rolled his wrist, looked at it, looked at her. That trade you made with Carver, he said. The drive. You didn't have it. No, she said. You bluffed a man like Carver, he said. Yes. And it worked. For 12 minutes, she said. Yes. He looked at her. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before, something that sat outside the vocabulary of a man who communicated primarily through threat and implication, something almost like respect, and almost like confusion, and underneath both of those, something that might have been, in a different life under different circumstances, something like gratitude. He didn't say any of those things. You know, he said, when I came in tonight, I told you to kneel. I remember, she said. I've told a lot of people that, he said. I know, she said. He looked at the ruined diner, at the fire extinguisher residue, and the broken glass, and the 2 men still on the floor waiting to be managed, at the pie display case and the overturned table, at all the evidence of the hour that had happened. None of them ever looked at me the way you did, he said. She stood up. Her knee said everything it had been saying, louder now that the adrenaline was finishing its work and leaving behind only what was actually there. She stood on it anyway. From outside, she heard the first distant sound of sirens, the approaching conversation of a city deciding to pay attention to this corner of itself, and the night was wet and quiet around that sound, and the diner smelled like everything that had happened, and somewhere in the back hallway she could hear the little girl's voice asking Otis a question, and she could hear Otis answering it in the low, careful way of someone who... She heard Otis answering it in the low, careful way of someone who had decided that a child deserved a real answer, not a distracted one, even in the middle of all of this. She stood in the diner and let that sound settle around her like something she needed. Then the sirens got louder, and she went to work. The next 20 minutes were a different kind of combat. No cast iron pans, no glass bottles, no geometry of entry points and bottlenecks and improvised weapons. Just the sustained, exhausting work of managing a scene before the people who controlled scenes arrived and took control of it in ways she couldn't predict or direct. She made decisions in fast sequence. Dante's people, the 8 who had come in, needed to not be visible when Chicago PD walked through the door, which meant they needed to be elsewhere, which meant she needed to tell them that clearly and quickly. The man who'd assessed Dante's wound understood immediately. He spoke to his people in the clipped economy of someone who'd had this exact conversation before, and they went, taking with them everything that needed to go with them, weapons, equipment, the specific visual evidence of who they were. Dante himself was the largest problem. You need to be gone, she told him. The police are going to walk into a diner with 6 incapacitated men and a radiator pipe with zip ties on it, she said. They're going to have questions. I need those questions to have answers, and you being here makes the answers impossible. She looked at him steadily. Your doctor is waiting. Your people can get you there. Go. He looked at her. The expression was back, the revised one, the one still being built. And underneath it she could see the specific resistance of a man who had spent a long time being the person who made decisions and was now in a situation where the right decision was to follow someone else's. The civilians, he said. Otis, Eleanor and her granddaughter. They're going to be questioned. I know, she said. What they say, they'll say what happened, she said. A group of men came in. There was a confrontation. Some of the men were incapacitated by another group of men who came to help and then left. She looked at him. That's true. It's incomplete, but it's true. And true incomplete is what holds up. And you? I work here, she said, for the last time. And this time it landed differently than it had every other time she'd said it tonight, landed with the full weight of what it meant and what it didn't mean, and what it had always been, partially true the way the best covers always were. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. He walked to the back of the diner without looking back, which she understood. The kind of man he was did not look back at exits. She watched him go anyway, watched the controlled gait, the hand still pressed to his side, the absolute refusal of his posture to announce that anything was wrong. And then he was through the kitchen and gone. She turned to the diner. Webb was on his feet. He looked at her, looked at the back of the diner where Dante had disappeared, looked at his men in their various states. "You're letting me walk too," he said. Not quite a question. "I'm not letting you do anything," she said. "You're a grown man making choices." She held his gaze. "Dion," she said. "The boy with the knife. Where does he live?" Webb blinked. The question had landed in an unexpected place. Why? "Because he's 19 and scared, and he left here tonight without anything resolved," she said. "And in my experience, that's when people go back to the thing they already know, even if the thing they already know is the thing that got them here." Webb was quiet. "He's got a mother," he said finally, "over on Kinsey. She doesn't know about—" He stopped. "She thinks he works construction." "Tell him," Leora said, "that the diner has a dishwasher position, 12 hours a week. It's not much, but it's a start, if he wants one." Webb stared at her. "You're offering my runner a dishwasher job." "I'm offering a 19-year-old an alternative," she said. "What he does with it is his business." Something worked through Webb's face that she couldn't fully name. It was layered, the suspicion first, then beneath it something that was almost disbelief. And underneath that, at the bottom, something she recognized from the way he'd talked about Dayon and about being sent in blind. A kind of exhausted grief for a particular kind of wasted potential that accumulated when you lived the way Webb had lived. The grief of a man who had made choices and watched others make the same choices and knew exactly where those choices ended. He didn't say anything else. He went to his men, the ones functional enough to move, which was most of them, and he said something short and precise, and they moved toward the front door. "Webb," she said. He stopped. Didn't turn. "The neighborhood," she said. "This block. Whatever arrangement you had with it before tonight, that's done." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. He went out the door. She stood in the empty diner. Empty was the wrong word. Otis was in the back. Eleanor and her granddaughter were in the back. 4 others were in the back. The men on the floor were still on the floor, the ones too incapacitated to walk. And they would be here when the police arrived. And that was fine, that was manageable. That was the version of events she could work with. But the diner was empty in the way it hadn't been in the last hour. The specific emptiness that followed the withdrawal of something that had been filling the space and the diner filled with it. With itself, with the smell of coffee and fire extinguisher residue and all the hours that had happened since 9:47. She picked up the coffee pot, the original one, the one she'd moved away from Webb's hand in the first minute of all of this. It still had coffee in it, warm, not hot. She poured herself a cup, sat down on the edge of the counter. She drank it. Her hands were not entirely steady. She looked at them, at the slight tremor she'd trained out, and that had come back through the simple biological truth of sustained maximum adrenaline followed by its absence. And she let the tremor be there without fighting it, because fighting it now served nothing. She sat on the edge of the counter in the ruined diner and she drank lukewarm coffee and she breathed. The sirens arrived outside. 2 patrol cars first, then a third, the doors opening and closing in quick succession. The radio chatter of officers approaching a location with partial information, which was the most cautious approach, which was correct. She watched through the blind gap as flashlights swept the exterior. She set the coffee down, stood up, went to the front door and opened it before they knocked. The officer in front was young, late 20s maybe, with the careful, alert composure of someone who had been on the job long enough to be good at it, but not so long that they'd stopped being careful. He looked at her, looked at the diner behind her, at the men on the floor, at the fire extinguisher residue, at the cracked pie display case. "Ma'am," he said, "are you injured?" She looked down at herself. Her uniform, she was still wearing her uniform, the faded one with the coffee stain on the left cuff, had acquired additional things since the start of the shift. She had a bruise developing along her right forearm that she could see even in the dim light. Her knee was doing what her knee was doing. "I'm functional," she said. "Is there anyone inside who needs immediate medical attention?" She thought about the men on the floor, thought about what immediate medical attention meant versus what could wait. The man near this window on the right has a shoulder injury he's been managing. The one by the far booth has a head injury that should be assessed. She stepped back to let them in. Everyone else is stable. The officer came in. His partner came in behind him. She watched them assess the room with the trained sweep of people whose job was exactly this, and she answered their questions as they came. Yes, she was an employee here. Yes, she had been present for the duration of the incident. Yes, she would be available to give a full statement. She answered everything she was asked and did not volunteer what she wasn't asked, and maintained the careful, cooperative demeanor of someone who had nothing to hide and also nothing extra to offer, which was the demeanor she'd been practicing for 2 years in this neighborhood, and which held now the way practiced things held. Otis came out of the back hallway. He'd waited until he heard the police, she realized, had given her the time she needed, had understood something about the sequencing without being told. He came out and he looked at the officers and he said, in the perfectly modulated voice of a 61-year-old man who cooked eggs for a living, "I'm the cook. I was in the kitchen for most of it. I've already spoken to 911. She looked at him. He looked back at her. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing with the multiple simultaneous expressions, and she held his gaze for one moment, just one moment, and then looked away. Eleanor May Hutchins emerged from the back hallway with her granddaughter's hand in hers, 72 years old, and composed in the way of someone who had processed the last hour during the time she'd spent waiting and had arrived at a kind of functional equilibrium that impressed Leora and did not entirely surprise her. "Detective," Eleanor said to the officer, who was not a detective, but Eleanor used the word as a matter of personal policy, and nobody corrected her. "Eleanor Hutchins, I'll tell you exactly what happened, and I'll need a cup of tea first." The little girl looked at Leora from beside her grandmother. Dark eyes, very serious, the same focused stillness as before. Then she held up the paper placemat she'd been coloring when all of this began, which she had somehow kept with her through everything. On it, she'd colored a picture of a woman. The woman in the drawing was tall and had long hair and was standing in what was probably meant to be the diner, with tables around her, and in one hand she was holding what might have been a coffee pot or might have been something else entirely depending on what a 6-year-old decided it was. And she was drawn in the confident, declarative lines of someone who had not yet learned to be uncertain about what they saw. Leora looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's very good," she said. The little girl considered her seriously. "I know," she said. Eleanor guided her toward the officers, and Leora stepped aside to let them pass, and the diner began the long process of becoming a scene of record rather than a site of chaos. She went behind the counter. She made more coffee, not because anyone had asked for it, because the coffee maker was there and making it was what her hands knew how to do at 2 a.m. in this diner, and doing what her hands knew took very little from her right now, which was all she had to give. She was on her second pot when the detective arrived. A real one this time, older, with the settled, unhurried quality of someone who had worked enough overnight shifts that the hour no longer registered as unusual. He introduced himself as Detective Ramirez. He sat across the counter from her on one of the stools that had survived the evening without incident. She told him a version of events that was true in all its structural elements and incomplete in the ways that mattered. A group of men came in. Their leader confronted her and she refused to cooperate. A physical altercation developed. She used what was available. Other men arrived through the back, a separate group unknown to her, possibly a competing criminal organization. And there was a second confrontation. Both groups eventually withdrew. Ramirez listened. He made notes. He asked clarifying questions with the patient, methodical precision of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had learned that rushing interviews produced incomplete pictures. "The men who came through the back," he said. "You said you didn't know them." "I'd never seen them before," she said. "But you spoke to one of them." "Briefly," she said. "About?" "About getting everyone off the block," she said. He looked at her. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular quality of attention that experienced investigators used when they were aware that the map they were being given was not entirely matching the territory. "You negotiated with a criminal organization," he said, "over a stolen phone at 2 a.m. in order to create a tactical withdrawal." She poured him coffee, set it in front of him. He looked at the coffee and then looked back at her. "Ms. Vale," he said, "what is it you do here exactly?" "I'm a waitress," she said. He was quiet for a moment. looked at his notes, looked at the diner, at the cracked pie display case and the ceiling hole from the gunshot and the fire extinguisher residue, and the two injured men currently being attended to by paramedics who had arrived in the last 10 minutes. He looked back at her. "Have you done anything like this before?" he said. She met his eyes. "Like what?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face suggested he was making a decision. Not the investigative decision, the one about documentation and follow-up in open case files, but a different kind, the kind that experienced people sometimes made when they were looking at a situation that was technically investigable and also, in some fundamental human way, complete. "You kept 23 people alive tonight," he said. 24, she said, "including myself." He was quiet. "Right," he said. He made a note. "I'll need you to come in for a full statement, tomorrow afternoon, if you're available." "I work the morning shift," she said. He looked up from his notes. She looked back at him. "I'll come in at 4, she said. He nodded, drank the coffee, set the cup down. "It's good," he said. "The coffee." "I've been making it for 2 years, she said. He left. She watched him go, watched him move through the diner with the attention of someone still processing, still filing, still turning over the shape of the night, and finding that its edges didn't match any standard template. She understood that feeling. The diner cleared slowly, the way disaster sites always cleared slowly. Not all at once, but in stages. The paramedics and the patrol officers, and the 2 men who were removed in handcuffs, and the investigators, and eventually, finally, the last of the official presence filtering out until the diner was quiet again. Otis stayed. He stayed after all of it, after his statement, and after the paramedic who had looked at his ribs and found them bruised but intact. And he stayed after Eleanor and her granddaughter were taken home in a patrol car at Eleanor's insistence. "I am not walking out of here in front of cameras. I have a reputation in this neighborhood." And after the last officer closed the door behind him, he stayed and he started cleaning. She heard the mop bucket, the specific sound of it, the wheels and the water that she'd heard at the end of every shift for 2 years. She stood at the counter and heard it and felt something in her chest that was complicated and tired and not entirely unpleasant. She went and got the other mop. They cleaned in silence for a while. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had too much and were letting the work carry some of it. Otis stopped, leaned on the mop handle, looked at her. "Before tonight," he said. "The 2 years. Did you know something like this was possible, coming here?" She thought about that. "No," she said. "I didn't know anything about this neighborhood. I just needed a neighborhood." "But you trained," he said, "for whatever that was." "I trained," she said, "for whatever it needed to be, whenever it needed to be. That's all." "That's not all," he said. She looked at him. "Because people who train for whatever it needs to be," he said, "still have something they're training toward. Some reason they get up in the morning and do whatever it is you were doing in the mornings, because I've seen you leave at 5 a.m. 3 times and come back by 6:30, and I never asked, but I'm asking now." She was quiet. "My father built a place like this one," she said finally. "He built it for a neighborhood that needed it. People who came there got fed and got looked after, and the neighborhood was," she paused, "better for it. And someone took that from him, from the neighborhood, from me." She leaned the mop against the counter. "I couldn't stop it then. I've spent 7 years making sure that's the last time I can't stop something." Otis looked at her for a long time. The kind of long time that 61-year-old men used when they were deciding whether to say the thing they were actually thinking. "And this place," he said, "Patsy's. Gerald's diner that smells like old grease and almost never gets reviewed by anyone." He looked around it. "What did it become? For you?" She looked at the diner, at the busted pie case and the plaster hole in the wall and the fire extinguisher residue that wasn't entirely cleaned yet and would require a second pass. At the table where Eleanor and her granddaughter had been sitting when all of this began, with the coloring placemat that was now in a patrol car somewhere, probably evidence. At the stool where she'd sat at the counter after it was over and drunk lukewarm coffee with shaking hands. "Somewhere I didn't have to pretend to be somewhere else," she said. Otis nodded, slowly, like the answer had confirmed something he'd suspected. "Leora," he said. "Otis. You're going to have to decide," he said, "after tonight, what this place is to you. what you are to it. Because that detective is going to come back, and the people whose men ended up on this floor are going to have questions eventually, and the neighborhood is going to... He paused. The neighborhood is going to know. It already knows. I can hear it. He tilted his head toward the street, toward the wet quiet of post-rain early morning. Word moves fast here. She knew that. She'd known it since the first patrol car arrived. I know, she said. So what are you going to do? He said. She picked up the mop again, worked a stretch of floor near the window, where the oil had spread earlier and where the linoleum needed more than one pass. I'm going to finish cleaning the diner, she said. He looked at her. And then? He said. And then I'm going to sleep, she said. And then I'm going to come in for the morning shift. And then I'm going to give a statement at 4 o'clock and come back and work the evening shift. She worked the mop in the slow, practiced strokes of someone who had done it thousands of times. And somewhere in there I'm going to figure out the rest. That's not a plan, he said. No, she said. It's not. He was quiet. Then he picked up his mop and went back to work. They finished around 4 in the morning. The diner was not clean. It was cleaned, which was different, which was the kind of clean that came from effort rather than starting conditions. The kind of clean that acknowledged what had happened and worked with it rather than erasing it. The cracked pie case was still cracked. The hole in the plaster was still there. The broken front window had been covered with cardboard from the kitchen by one of the patrol officers, a practical kindness that Leora had noted and been unexpectedly moved by. Otis locked the kitchen, put on his coat, stood at the back door. Get your knee looked at, he said. I will, she said. Today, he said. Not eventually. Today. Otis. I'm not above calling you about this, he said. I have the number. I know you have the number, she said. He looked at her. One more moment of the complicated, layered thing his face had been doing all night. And then he did something he had never done in 2 years, which was to put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not a hug, not dramatic, just a hand and a brief pressure and then gone. And he went out the back door. She stood in the kitchen alone. She turned off the remaining lights, checked the doors, back door locked, front door locked, the cardboard window covering secure. She did the checks the way she always did them, end of shift, the routine of closing that she'd done so many hundreds of times that her body did it without instruction. She put on her coat, her own coat, not the uniform, which she'd hung on its hook in the back the way she always did, because the morning shift would need it, because she would need it, because some things continued. She went out the back door. The alley was quiet. The rain smell was beginning to lift, replaced by the first intimation of a different smell. Whatever the city smelled like at 4 in the morning, when the weather had cleared and the night was running out, something that was almost freshness filtered through exhaust and river water, and the accumulated particular character of Chicago in late summer. She walked. Her knee was communicating with the full force of everything it had to say, which was considerable, and she walked anyway, at a pace that acknowledged the knee without surrendering to it. 6 blocks to her apartment. She knew the route the way she knew the diner, completely, with the redundant awareness of someone who always had more than one way home. She walked the main way tonight. She wasn't sure why. She always took the back way, the route with fewer lit windows, fewer possible witnesses, the route that kept her as invisible as possible. Tonight she walked the main street, past the closed storefronts, and the one bar that was still lit at this hour, and the laundromat that was always open, always, every hour of every day, with its perpetual 1 or 2 customers at any given time, the insomniac customers, the night shift customers, the customers who were between places in ways that weren't entirely logistical. She'd been one of those customers, at various points in 7 years. She walked past the laundromat and looked in through the window without stopping. One woman inside, middle-aged, sitting in a plastic chair with her eyes closed while a dryer ran. Resting. Just resting in a warm place at 4 in the morning, between wherever she'd been and wherever she was going. Leora kept walking. Her phone, the diner landline number she used for anything that needed a number. Her personal phone was prepaid and changed every 6 months. Had 3 messages by the time she checked it at her apartment door. 2 were from numbers she didn't recognize, which she noted and set aside. 1 was from a number she didn't have saved but recognized anyway, because she had a very good memory for numbers, and this one had appeared in a contact list she'd accessed briefly on a stolen phone earlier that night. She stood in the doorway of her apartment and looked at the message. It said, "The neighborhood will be handled. The arrangement will be different going forward. I don't ask for anything in return, but I would like to buy you a cup of coffee sometime, if that's acceptable." D. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went inside. Her apartment was what it had been for 2 years, small, functional, sparse in the way of someone who had made a decision about accumulation. A single bookshelf. A kitchen table that was also a desk. A window that faced the alley behind the building, which she'd chosen deliberately, which meant she had a view of nothing interesting but complete awareness of anything that moved in the space behind the building. She sat on the edge of her bed. She looked at her hands. The tremor was gone now. She'd metabolized enough that the hands were steady again, which was good, which was what they were supposed to be. She looked at her knee. It needed ice and elevation and probably imaging tomorrow, which was today, which was in a few hours. She looked at the message on her phone. She thought about a man sitting in the darkest booth in a diner with his hand pressed to his side and his coffee going cold, traveling without his people because someone inside his organization had decided his time was finished. She thought about the way he'd listened when she'd given instructions, without questioning and without performing compliance, actually listening, the way people listened when they were genuinely willing to be guided by someone who knew more about the specific situation than they did, which was a rarer quality than it should have been, in her experience, in men like him. She thought about what he'd asked her. Why did you stay? And what she'd told him. Because someone needed to, which was true, which was entirely true. And also, she sat with this in the quiet of 4 a.m, not the whole of it. She'd stayed because the diner had become something to her. Not in the way she'd planned for it to become something. She hadn't planned for anything. She just needed a neighborhood, and she'd found a diner that needed a waitress. And she'd done the job the way she did everything, completely and without reservation, and somewhere in 2 years of doing it completely. The diner had become real to her in the way that places became real when you put your actual life into them. It had become her father's restaurant. Not literally. Not in the nostalgic replacement sense that would have made it smaller than it was, but in the functional, essential sense, a place that looked like nothing from outside and meant something specific to the people who came through its doors, the people who came in for the black coffee and the chicken sandwich, for the chamomile tea, for the Tuesday lemon meringue pie with the newspaper they didn't read. People who came to be somewhere that looked after them without announcement. She'd looked after them tonight. She sat with that. Not with pride, exactly. With something quieter than pride. With the acknowledgement of a thing that had happened, and that was its own justification. Outside, the sky over Chicago was doing the thing it did before dawn. Not getting light yet, but getting less dark. The incremental grudging shift from the specific black of 4 a.m. toward the gray of 5. She watched it through the alley window. She picked up the phone. She looked at the message. She typed back, "The coffee can wait. But if you want to keep that promise about using what you have to protect instead of rule, I'll hold you to it." She set the phone down. She lay back on the bed, still in her coat, still in her shoes, which she'd been wearing for 22 hours and which she would take off in a few minutes, but not yet. Right now she was going to let the city get less dark outside her alley window, and she was going to be still, just still, in the way she hadn't been once since 9:47 the previous evening. Her knee ached. Her forearm ached. The side of her head where Webb had grabbed her hair ached with the particular lingering insistence of scalp injuries, which were always disproportionate to their severity. She ran a mental inventory the way she always did at the end of a physical day. What was hurt, how badly, what needed attention, and what was just complaining. All of it fell in the second category. Everything was complaining. Nothing was serious. She thought about Dion, somewhere in the city, in his mother's house on Kinsey, maybe asleep, maybe not, maybe lying the same way she was lying and looking at whatever ceiling he had and running the inventory of the night. 19 years old. A mother who thought he worked construction. She thought about Eleanor Hutchins, 72, who had dropped her weight at the right moment and who had come out of a storage room after 50 minutes and asked for tea with the composure of someone who had decided that composure was the most useful thing she could offer the situation. She thought about Otis, his bad knee, his hand on her shoulder for one brief, waited moment. Get your knee looked at. Today. Not eventually. She thought about a detective named Ramirez who had drunk his coffee without comment and had not asked the question she'd been most afraid of. and whether that was wisdom or pragmatism or something more specific that she'd have to figure out at 4 o'clock this afternoon. She thought about Carver, about 9 years of trust ending on a kitchen floor while a 61-year-old man with a bad knee applied pressure with both hands and didn't complain about it. She thought about what it meant to make a decision about succession and what it cost. Not to Dante, not to Carver, but to every person in the 9-year radius of that decision, all the people caught in the geography of powerful men failing each other. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she allowed herself to think about him now, which was differently from how she'd thought about him in the first years after, not with the raw physical grief of fresh loss, but with the settled, specific ache of someone who had been carrying something long enough that it had changed shape. I was not a wound anymore. He was a weight she'd chosen to keep, because the weight was also the reason, and without the reason, the years of training were just years of learning to hurt people efficiently, which was not what she had ever wanted them to be. She'd wanted them to be, the next time someone could stop it. Tonight, someone had. She closed her eyes. Sleep came in the way it came when the body had decided the conversation was over. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the simple animal collapse of a system that had been running at maximum for too long. She was asleep before the sky got light, and she slept without dreaming, which was the best sleep she knew how to have. She woke at 8:15. Morning light through the alley window. The city doing its morning business outside. The garbage trucks, the deliveries, the accumulating sound of a neighborhood returning to its ordinary version of itself. She lay still for a moment. She thought about whether the diner would open today. Thought about Gerald, who came in on Fridays, who would be getting a phone call this morning from a number he wouldn't recognize, and who would arrive to find his diner covered in fire extinguisher residue with a hole in the wall and a cracked pie case, and who would have feelings about this that she was going to have to manage, and who would also, knowing Gerald, have the most specific and predictable complaint of all the complaints available, which was going to be about the electricity bill somehow. She sat up. She took off her shoes. Finally. Set them side by side, neatly, because she kept things neat, because neat was a form of control, and control was a form of preparedness, and old habits were the architecture of a life. She checked her phone. Dante had replied. A single line. I know. I'll keep it. She looked at that for a moment. Then she looked at the 2 unknown numbers from the night before. She'd have to figure out what those were. Probably reporters. News traveled fast, even at 4 in the morning, and a diner in the Harbor District with multiple injuries and a police response was the kind of thing that made certain calls inevitable. She'd handle it. She got up. Made coffee in the small kitchen of her small apartment. Stood at the window while it brewed and looked at the alley, which in the morning light was just an alley, wet still from last night's rain, a dumpster and a loading door and the back wall of the building across from hers. She'd looked at this alley every morning for 2 years. Today it looked the same as it always had. That was not a small thing. She recognized it as not a small thing. The coffee finished. She poured a cup. She thought about the morning shift. Thought about whether the diner could open, given the state of it. Thought about the pie case and the plaster and the cardboard window, and whether Gerald could be persuaded that opening was both possible and necessary because the neighborhood regulars were going to come. She knew that. They always came after something happened. The ones who came to Patsy's came because it was open, and it was there, and it meant something to them in the way that unremarkable places became remarkable through consistency, and they would need it to be open. She would go in early. She would assess the damage in daylight. She would call Gerald before Gerald called her, and she would have a version of events that was complete enough to answer his questions and incomplete enough to let him decide how much he wanted to know. She drank her coffee. Her knee was an 8 out of 10 in the morning light, which was a number she was filing for 4 o'clock when she had her appointment. Her forearm was purple, as predicted. The side of her head was fine. She was going to be fine. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the accumulated, incremental way that things became fine after they had been very much not fine, through the application of time and the continuation of ordinary life, which was its own form of courage, she thought. The courage not of refusing to kneel, not of going forward into a doorway with nothing left, but the courage of going in the next morning and making coffee and doing the job. She washed the cup. She went to the closet, found her other uniform, the backup, put it on. It was slightly too large in the shoulders, the same way the first one had been, the way all the uniforms were, because Gerald ordered mediums and she wore a small, and it had never come up in 2 years in a way she'd felt worth addressing. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the bathroom sink. She looked like a waitress. She looked like someone who had been doing this job for 2 years and intended to keep doing it, which was true. And she looked like someone who was tired and had a bruised arm and needed to ice a knee, which was also true. And she looked like the person she had been before 9:47 the previous evening, which was partially true in all the ways that mattered, and not true at all in one specific way she was still identifying. She'd been trying to be invisible. She understood, standing at the mirror at 8:30 in the morning, that invisible was no longer precisely available to her. The diner knew what she was. The neighborhood was going to know what she was. Detective Ramirez had a file with her name on it. Eleanor Hutchins knew her face. Dion, wherever he was, knew her face. Otis had always known more than he'd said, and now he knew more than that. She was not invisible anymore. She looked at herself in the mirror and she decided, in the quiet, specific way of decisions that were not dramatic and did not announce themselves, but simply arrived in the ordinary light of a morning, that she was not sorry. She'd been hiding in plain sight for 7 years. She'd built a life inside the hiding, a real one, a functional one, with a diner and an Otis and a Tuesday regular with lemon meringue pie. And the life had been valuable regardless of the hiding. But the hiding had also been the frame around it, and the frame was gone now. What was left was the life. She picked up her keys. She walked the 6 blocks to the diner in the morning light of a Chicago August, past the laundromat where the dryers ran all night and the closed storefronts beginning to open and the wet pavement drying in the early heat. And the Harbor District did what it always did in the morning, which was to do its business with the particular unself-conscious energy of a neighborhood that had been doing its business for a long time and intended to keep doing it. She unlocked the front door of Patsy's. She turned on the lights. The diner looked, in the daylight, like exactly what it was, a place that had been through something and was still standing. The crack in the pie case caught the morning light. The cardboard window made the front corner dim. The plaster hole above the pie display was smaller than she remembered it feeling in the dark. She went behind the counter. She started the coffee. She stood in the quiet of the early morning in the diner that smelled like old coffee and something else now, something she'd have to clean through. And she listened to the coffee maker work its way through its process. And she thought about nothing in particular, which was the most honest thing she could think about. And she was still standing there when the first customer arrived at 9:15, the old man with his folded newspaper, the one who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and always ordered the lemon meringue pie, who stopped in the door and looked at the diner with the expression of someone who had heard something and come to see, and who looked at Leora behind the counter, and who said nothing, and sat down in his regular spot. She brought him his pie. She brought him his water with no ice. He looked up at her. Then he looked at the diner, at all of it, at the evidence of everything, and then he looked back at her. "You okay?" he said. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded. Like that was the right answer. Like he'd known it would be that answer. He unfolded his newspaper. She went back to the counter. Outside, a second customer was coming through the door, and then a third, and the morning was beginning the way mornings began, and the coffee was ready, and Lyora Vale picked up the pot and went to work.